Welcome, dear friends, to a quiet journey. Tonight, we're going to travel together through a place that has witnessed more than 12,000 years of human story, a landscape so vast and varied that it seems to hold all the extremes of the American West in its borders. This is Wyoming, a name that comes from a Delaware word meaning at the big river flat, though the state itself is anything but flat. Here mountains thrust skyward with such force that they scrape the clouds, while plains stretch endlessly in golden waves that seem to touch the edge of the world itself. Before we start, I'd love to know something. If you actually live in the USA, which state are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Perhaps you actually live in Wyoming, and the history of your home state has significant meaning for your life. Maybe you've even come across artifacts from ancient times or stories passed down through generations that connect you more deeply to the land. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. What makes Wyoming remarkable isn't just its grandeur, though the scenery certainly takes your breath away. It's the way human beings have moved through this landscape, adapting to its challenges, finding sustenance in its abundance, and leaving traces of their presence that we can still read today like pages in the longest book ever written. From the very first people who followed migrating herds across land bridges and mountain passes, to the fur trappers who named its rivers, to the pioneers who crossed its high plains with everything they owned packed into wagons, to the modern communities that call it home, Wyoming has always been a place of passage and transformation. So settle in. Let's begin at the beginning, when the glaciers were still retreating and the land was taking the shape we would recognize today. The story starts longer ago than most of us can easily imagine. Picture this: more than 12 millennia in the past, the great ice sheets that covered much of North America were melting, retreating northward, and leaving behind a transformed landscape. The climate was different then, cooler and wetter in many places. The animals were different too. Mastodons and woolly mammoths still roamed these lands, along with giant ground sloths, dire wolves, and short-faced bears that stood taller than any grizzly you might encounter today. Into this world came the first human beings to call Wyoming home. They were Paleo-Indians, hunter-gatherers who had migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge, spreading gradually southward and eastward across two continents. These weren't primitive people in any meaningful sense. They possessed sophisticated knowledge of their environment, understanding animal behavior, plant cycles, and the movement of seasons with an intimacy that few of us could match today. They crafted tools from stone with such skill that archaeologists can identify different cultural traditions just by examining the shape and technique of a single spear point. One of the most remarkable archaeological sites in Wyoming dates from this ancient period. It's called the Colby Mammoth Kill Site, located near the town of Worland in the Bighorn Basin. Here, roughly 11,000 years ago, a group of hunters successfully killed and butchered several Columbian mammoths. Think about that for a moment. These animals stood over 13 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed perhaps 10 tons. Hunting them required not just courage but careful planning, cooperation, and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. The hunters at Colby drove the mammoths into a natural trap, then used spears tipped with carefully crafted clovis points to bring down these enormous creatures. The clovis points themselves are marvels of Stone Age technology. Each one was knapped from high-quality stone, often chert or obsidian, through hundreds of precise strikes that removed flakes in just the right pattern. The result was a point with a distinctive fluted channel running partway up each face, a design feature that helped the point attach securely to a wooden shaft. These weren't crude weapons, they were precision instruments, and the people who made them understood principles of fracture mechanics that wouldn't be formally described by scientists for thousands of years. But the Colby site tells us more than just how these early people hunted. The bones show evidence of careful butchering, and some were stacked in neat piles, possibly covered with meat and fat, as a way of storing food for later use. This suggests planning for the future, an understanding that resources might be scarce at other times. It speaks to a kind of intelligence and foresight that reminds us these were fully modern humans, people whose capacity for thought and feeling matched our own. As the centuries passed and the climate continued to change, the great megafauna, gradually disappeared. Whether through hunting pressure, climate shifts, or some combination of factors, the mammoths and mastodons vanished from the landscape. The people who lived here adapted. This is perhaps the most consistent theme in Wyoming's long human history: adaptation. When conditions changed, people changed with them, developing new tools, new strategies, new ways of understanding and using the land. By about 8,000 years ago, we enter what archaeologists call the Archaic period. The people of this era hunted smaller game, bison primarily, but also elk, deer, and pronghorn. They gathered a wide variety of plant foods, roots, seeds, berries, and nuts. Their toolkits became more diverse, including not just spear points but also knives, scrapers for processing hides, grinding stones for preparing plant materials, and eventually, revolutionary new hunting technologies. One of these innovations was the atlatol, or spear thrower. Imagine a stick about 2 feet long, with a hook or socket at one end. By placing the butt of a spear into this socket, and using the atlatol as a lever to extend your throwing arm, you could launch a spear with much greater force and accuracy than throwing by hand alone. This technology spread across the Americas and remained in use for thousands of years. Later, perhaps around 2,000 years ago, an even more transformative technology appeared: the bow and arrow, lighter, faster, and more accurate than the atlatol. The bow would change hunting and warfare across the region. But we shouldn't think of these ancient peoples as focused solely on survival. Human beings have always been more than their technology, more than their hunting strategies. We've always created meaning, sought to understand our place in the cosmos, and tried to connect with forces beyond ourselves. Wyoming's landscape bears witness to this dimension of ancient life in remarkable ways. Consider the Medicine Wheel, located high in the Bighorn Mountains, at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet. This is one of the most impressive and mysterious archaeological sites in North America. Picture a circle of stones roughly 80 feet in diameter, with 28 spokes radiating from a central cairn to an outer ring. Additional cairns mark specific points along the circumference. The whole structure lies on a windswept plateau, where snow lingers late into summer, and the air is thin enough to make every breath an effort. Why would anyone build such a thing in such a place? The answer, like so many aspects of ancient cultures, remains partly mysterious. But careful archaeological and astronomical study has revealed some fascinating possibilities. Some of the cairns align with the rising and setting positions of the sun at the summer solstice. Others mark the rising points of particularly bright stars, Aldebaran, Rigel, and Sirius, that dawn during the summer months. These alignments suggest the Medicine Wheel functioned as a kind of calendar or astronomical observatory, helping people track the seasons and time important ceremonies or communal gatherings. But it was surely more than just a practical tool. The effort required to create it, the choice of such a high and remote location, the careful attention to celestial events, all point to something sacred. This was a place where earth and sky met, where human beings could feel themselves part of something larger. For many Native American peoples today, the Medicine Wheel remains a sacred site, a place of ceremony and prayer. The Crow people have traditional stories about its origin. Other tribes, the Shoshone, Arapaho, and Cheyenne among them, also recognize its spiritual significance. Medicine Wheel isn't the only such site in Wyoming. Across the state, you can find cairns, stone circles, rock alignments, and other structures that speak to the spiritual life of ancient peoples. Many are far less dramatic than Medicine Wheel, just a few stones arranged in a pattern that might escape notice unless you knew what to look for. But each represents someone's effort to mark the landscape, to create a connection between the human and the sacred, to say here matters, this place is significant. Rock art offers another window into the minds and spirits of ancient peoples. Throughout Wyoming, on canyon walls and boulder faces, you can find petroglyphs, images pecked or carved into rock, and pictographs, paintings made with mineral pigments. Some depict animals, bison, elk, bighorn sheep, bears. Others show human figures, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, sometimes engaged in recognizable activities like hunting or dancing. Still others present more abstract or mysterious images, geometric patterns, handprints, shapes that might represent shields or supernatural beings. What did these images mean to the people who created them? Some may have been sympathetic magic, a way of ensuring success in the hunt by depicting the desired outcome. Others might have marked important locations, sacred sites, or territorial boundaries. Some could have been part of vision quests, where young people sought spiritual power and guidance through fasting and isolation. The images might record historical events, tell stories, or communicate with the spirit world. Likely, different images served different purposes, and their meanings were layered and complex, just as the cultures that produced them were layered and complex. One remarkable concentration of rock art exists in the Legend Rock petroglyph site near Thermopolis. Here, on sandstone cliffs above Cottonwood Creek, ancient artists created hundreds of images over a period spanning perhaps 3,000 years or more. The oldest might date to the late Archaic period, while the most recent could be only a few hundred years old. Walking among these images, you're moving through time, seeing layer upon layer of human expression and meaning. The variety is striking. Some figures are naturalistic, carefully shaped to resemble particular animals or people. Others are highly stylized or abstract. Some images are tiny, just a few inches across, while others span several feet. You can see shield-bearing warriors, shamanic figures with elaborate headdresses, animals of various species, and intricate geometric designs. It's like a library written in stone, though one whose language we can only partially read. As we move forward in time, approaching the period Europeans would call the historic era, the patterns of life in Wyoming took on forms that would persist right up until the catastrophic changes of the 19th century. By about 500 years ago, the peoples living in and traveling through Wyoming had developed distinctive cultures adapted to the region's diverse environments. The Shoshone people ranged widely across Wyoming, from the mountains in the west to the plains in the center of the territory. They spoke a Uto-Aztecan language, connecting them to a linguistic family that stretched from the Great Basin to central Mexico. The Eastern Shoshone, the groups most associated with Wyoming, were skilled horsemen and buffalo hunters, though they also gathered pine nuts and other plant foods and hunted smaller game in the mountains. Their society was organized around bands, flexible groups that could come together for communal hunts or ceremonies, and then disperse into smaller family units when resources were scattered. When did the Shoshone acquire horses? This question matters because horses transformed plains culture so dramatically that it's hard to imagine what life was like before them. Horses had once been native to North America, evolving here over millions of years, but they went extinct at the end of the last ice age. At the same time, the mammoths and other megafauna disappeared. They returned with the Spanish in the 16th century, and within a remarkably short time, through trade and capture, horses spread across the western half of the continent. By the early 18th century, the Shoshone had horses, and they had become formidable mounted warriors and hunters. Horses allowed them to follow buffalo herds more effectively, to travel greater distances, to carry more possessions, and to wage war more successfully. For a time, mounted Shoshone bands dominated much of Wyoming, and even ranged eastward onto the high plains, challenging groups that didn't yet have horses. But advantage in plains warfare was always temporary. By the mid-18th century, other tribes had acquired both horses and guns, the latter obtained through trade with French and British merchants to the east. The Lakota, expanding westward from the Great Lakes region, under pressure from tribes that had already obtained firearms, began pushing into Wyoming's eastern plains. The Crow, moving southward from the Missouri River country, established themselves in the Bighorn Basin and Powder River country. The Arapaho, allied with the Cheyenne, claimed hunting grounds in eastern Wyoming. These movements weren't simple invasions or migrations. They were complex processes involving warfare, certainly, but also alliance, trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The picture was fluid, dynamic, constantly shifting. Tribal territories overlapped and changed from season to season, year to year. What mattered wasn't fixed boundaries in the way a modern state might think of them, but rather access to resources, buffalo ranges, river valleys with reliable water and timber, sacred sites and trade routes. The buffalo deserves special attention because it was so central to plains cultures. The American bison, to use its proper name, is a remarkable animal. Bulls can weigh a ton or more and stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder. Despite their bulk, they're surprisingly fast, capable of running 35 miles per hour. They're also tough, able to survive brutal winters on the open plains by using their massive heads to sweep away snow and reach the grass beneath. Before European contact, enormous herds of bison ranged across the Great Plains. How many were there? Estimates vary widely, but somewhere between 30 and 60 million is a reasonable guess. These herds were constantly on the move, following the grass, seeking water, responding to weather and seasons. They created a moving feast for the peoples who depended on them. And depend on them they did. The buffalo provided not just meat, though that was crucial, hundreds of pounds of protein and fat from a single animal. The hides became lodge covers, robes and clothing. Sinew made thread and bowstrings. Bones became tools and ornaments. Horns became cups and spoons. Even the tail could be useful, as a fly whisk or a ceremonial object. Dried buffalo dung served as fuel on the treeless plains. The animal's stomach could be used as a water container. Essentially, every part of the buffalo had a use. This wasn't mindless exploitation. Plains peoples developed elaborate protocols about when and how to hunt buffalo, how to butcher them properly, and how to show respect for the animal's spirit. The buffalo was understood as a gift, a relative in some spiritual sense, not just a resource. Waste was avoided, not merely for practical reasons, but for spiritual ones. To waste the buffalo's gift was to show disrespect, to risk offending the spirits who controlled the herds and thus jeopardize future hunts. Communal buffalo hunts were major events that required cooperation, leadership, and careful planning. One method was the buffalo jump, where hunters would carefully maneuver a herd toward a cliff or steep drop-off. This required detailed knowledge of the landscape and of buffalo behavior. Drivers would position themselves to gradually guide the animals in the right direction, perhaps using rock cairns or other markers to create funnel-shaped lanes. At the critical moment, they would stampede the herd toward the precipice. The buffalo in front, pushed by those behind, would plunge over the edge. Below, other hunters would be waiting to finish off any animals that survived the fall and begin the massive task of butchering. One famous buffalo jump site, though it's north of Wyoming in Montana, gives you a sense of how long this technique was used. Head smashed-in buffalo jump has evidence of use spanning nearly 6,000 years. Similar sites exist throughout the plains and mountain regions. These jumps were communal property, places that bands returned to generation after generation. Knowledge about how to use them effectively was passed down through oral tradition, from elders to young hunters. Another hunting method that became common after horses arrived was the surround. Mounted hunters would circle a buffalo herd, gradually tightening the circle while others moved in for the kill. This required skilled horsemanship and precise coordination. Hunting buffalo from horseback was dangerous. The animals, when wounded or threatened, would fight back. Hunters could be gored, trampled, or thrown from their horses. Accidents were common, but the rewards when a hunt was successful were enormous. A single surround could yield enough meat to feed a band for months if properly preserved. Much of the meat was dried to make jerky or pounded with fat and berries to make pemmican, a concentrated food that could last for years if kept dry. This preservation technology was crucial for surviving winter and for accumulating surplus that could be traded. Indeed, the fur trade era that would transform Wyoming in the early 19th century depended in part on pemmican, which became a staple food for trappers and voyageurs. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Before we arrive at the fur trade, we should spend a bit more time with Wyoming's native peoples in the centuries before European contact became a dominant force in their lives. What was daily life like? How were their societies organized? What did they believe? Let's imagine a summer camp of an Eastern Shoshone band in the 18th century, before everything changed. The band has come together for the communal buffalo hunt, so there might be several hundred people gathered in a valley where a clear stream runs down from the mountains. The camp is a temporary city of tipis, conical lodges made from buffalo hide stretched over a framework of wooden poles. Each tipi belongs to a family, or sometimes an extended family group. The tipi is an ingenious piece of engineering. It's portable, essential for people who move frequently. It can be erected or taken down in less than an hour by a few people working together. It's stable in wind, the conical shape allowing gusts to flow around it. It can be ventilated by adjusting the smoke flaps at the top, and a fire can be kept burning inside, even in bitter cold. The floor might be covered with willow branches and then buffalo robes for comfort and insulation. Walk through this camp in the morning, and you'd see people engaged in dozens of different activities. Women would be tending fires, preparing food, watching children. Some would be working on hides, a process that required multiple days of labor. First, the hide had to be staked out and scraped clean of flesh and fat. Then it would be treated with a mixture of brains, liver, and fat, which helped break down the proteins and make the hide soft. After drying, it would be worked and pulled to keep it supple, then sometimes smoked to make it water-resistant. A skilled hide worker could produce leather of remarkable quality, soft enough for clothing, durable enough for moccasins, that could withstand hard travel. Men might be checking weapons, making arrows, caring for horses. Arrow making was skilled work. The shaft had to be straight and smooth, often made from shoots of serviceberry or chokecherry that had been carefully selected and seasoned. Fletching, usually from eagle or hawk feathers, had to be attached precisely to make the arrow fly true. The point might be stone, though increasingly by this period, metal points obtained through trade were preferred for their durability and ability to hold an edge. Children would be playing, but their play often mimicked adult activities. Boys might practice with small bows, learning to shoot at targets. Girls might have toy tipis, and would be learning the skills they'd need as adults: hide working, quill work, food preparation. This wasn't formal schooling in the way we think of it. Learning happened through observation, imitation, and participation. Children were included in adult life from an early age, given tasks appropriate to their ability, and gradually taking on more responsibility. Elders would have special status. They were the keepers of knowledge, stories, songs, ceremonies, history, practical wisdom about where to find resources and how to predict weather. A good memory was highly valued because this was an oral culture. Everything that needed to be remembered had to be carried in human minds and passed on through human voices. The elders could tell stories of events from their own lives and from the lives of their parents and grandparents, creating a continuous chain of remembered history stretching back generations. Religious life permeated everything. This wasn't a matter of separate sacred and secular spheres. The spiritual and the practical were intertwined. Before a hunt, there would be ceremonies to ask for success and to show respect to the buffalo spirits. After a successful hunt, there would be ceremonies of thanksgiving. Individuals might seek visions through fasting and isolation, hoping for guidance from spirit helpers. Shamans or medicine people served as intermediaries with the spirit world, conducting healing ceremonies, divining the future, or conducting rituals to bring rain or ensure the herd's return. The sun dance was perhaps the most important ceremony for many plains tribes, though practices varied from one culture to another. This was an annual gathering, usually in early summer, when multiple bands would come together. The ceremony involved days of preparation, the construction of a special lodge, and dancing that could last for days. Participants, usually men, would dance while gazing at the sun, fasting from food and water, praying for visions, or giving thanks for blessings received. Some would pierce their chest muscles with wooden skewers attached to rawhide thongs, tied to the central pole of the sun dance lodge, and would dance until the skewers tore free, offering their pain and sacrifice for the good of their people. To outsiders, particularly to the Euro-Americans who would later witness and often misunderstand these ceremonies, this could seem brutal or savage. But to the participants, it was a profound expression of faith and community. The sun dance renewed the world, ensured the buffalo would return, healed the sick, and bound the community together in shared meaning and purpose. It was both deeply personal, each dancer making his own prayers and sacrifices, and communal, the entire tribe participating as dancers, singers, and witnesses. Trade connected Wyoming's native peoples to a vast network that stretched across the continent long before Europeans arrived. Obsidian from the Yellowstone area has been found in archaeological sites hundreds of miles away. Marine shells from the Pacific coast and the Gulf of California made their way to the plains. Turquoise from the southwest turned up in northern sites. This trade wasn't just a matter of economics, it was social, diplomatic, spiritual. Trade relationships often involved kinship ties, either real or ceremonial. Trading partners might exchange gifts, as much as commodities, creating bonds of obligation and reciprocity that could last for generations. When horses arrived, they quickly became valuable trade goods themselves. A man's wealth and status might be measured in horses. Horses were given as bride price when a couple married. They were offered as gifts to cement alliances or compensate for injuries. They were gambled in games of chance. They were raided in warfare, horse stealing becoming a primary objective of many military expeditions. A successful raid that captured enemy horses could elevate a young man's status dramatically. Warfare, we should acknowledge, was part of life. Conflicts arose over hunting territories, over horses, over captives, over honor and revenge. But plains warfare, before the devastating conflicts of the reservation era, operated according to certain codes. Counting coup, touching an enemy in battle without killing him, was often valued more highly than killing. Taking scalps provided proof of victory and spiritual power. Capturing horses and other property was a primary goal. Pitched battles to the death were relatively rare. Most combat involved raids, skirmishes, and ambushes, rather than large-scale warfare. This doesn't mean warfare was bloodless or trivial. People died, communities grieved. Cycles of revenge could span generations. But the goal was usually to demonstrate courage, gain wealth and status, and protect one's people, not to annihilate the enemy entirely. Total war, the attempt to destroy another people completely, was something that would arrive with the Euro-American military in the 19th century. Now let's turn our attention to the first outsiders to enter this world, the first Europeans and Euro-Americans to see Wyoming's mountains and plains and leave records of what they found. The Spanish were the first Europeans to approach Wyoming, though they never penetrated very far into the region. In the 18th century, Spanish explorers and traders from New Mexico ventured northward, reaching parts of what's now southern Wyoming, but Spain's influence remained limited. The real opening of Wyoming to Euro-American knowledge came from another direction, the north and east, along the rivers that drained toward the Missouri. The story of the Lewis and Clark expedition is well known. In 1804 and 1805, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led a corps of discovery up the Missouri River, across the Continental Divide, and down the Columbia to the Pacific Ocean. Their mission, commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, was to find a practical water route across the continent, to gather scientific information, and to establish American claims to the Oregon Country. The expedition didn't pass through Wyoming proper, but it set the stage for what would follow. One member of that expedition would become the first Euro-American to see Wyoming's wonders and survive to tell about it. His name was John Coulter, and he's one of those characters from history who seems almost larger than life, someone whose adventures strain credibility even though they're well documented. Coulter joined the Lewis and Clark expedition as a private, one of the enlisted men who did much of the hard work, rowing, portaging, hunting, standing guard. He proved himself capable and reliable, and in 1806, as the expedition was returning east, Lewis and Clark granted him permission to leave the group early. He wanted to join two trappers heading back upriver to hunt for furs. This was a remarkable decision. Imagine being so close to home after more than 2 years in the wilderness and choosing to turn around and go back. Coulter spent the next several years in the Rocky Mountain region, trapping, trading, and exploring. In 1807, he was working for Manuel Lisa, a Spanish trader who had established a trading post at the junction of the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers. Lisa sent Coulter on a solo journey through the winter to contact native tribes and encourage them to trade at the post. This journey, which probably covered about 500 miles through what is now northwestern Wyoming, took Coulter through some of the most spectacular and geologically unusual landscapes in North America. He apparently crossed into the Yellowstone region, possibly seeing the geysers, hot springs, and mud pots that would later make the area famous. When he returned and told others about what he'd seen, many didn't believe him. They thought he was telling tall tales, inventing stories about boiling springs and fountains of water that shot into the air. The area became known derisively as Coulter's Hell. But Coulter wasn't lying. He really had seen these wonders, though it would be decades before official expeditions confirmed his accounts, and many more years before Yellowstone became a national park. Coulter's most famous adventure came in 1808 and has become legendary. He and another trapper, John Potts, were trapping beaver along the Jefferson River when they were surprised by a large group of Blackfeet warriors. The Blackfeet and Euro-American trappers were enemies, the tribe having decided, not unreasonably, that these outsiders represented a threat to their territory and resources. In the confrontation that followed, Potts was killed, Coulter was captured. What happened next sounds like fiction, but multiple accounts, including Coulter's own, agree on the basic facts. The Blackfeet stripped him naked and took away his weapons. Then, after a discussion among themselves, they told him to run. They were going to hunt him for sport, giving him a head start before warriors came after him. Coulter ran. The terrain was an open plain, covered with prickly pear cactus. His bare feet were quickly torn and bleeding, but he ran for his life, and apparently he was fast. After several miles, only one pursuer was still close. This warrior carried a spear. Coulter, exhausted, decided he had to fight. He stopped suddenly, turned, and confronted the warrior, who was surprised by this move and stumbled. Coulter grabbed the spear, killed the warrior, and kept running. He reached the Madison River and hid in a jam of driftwood and logs, submerging himself in the icy water with just his nose above the surface. The Blackfeet searched for him, some even walking on the log jam above his hiding place, but they didn't find him. After dark, he emerged and began walking toward the nearest trading post, Fort Raymond, over 200 miles away. He had no clothes, no food, no weapons. It took him 11 days. He survived by eating roots and bark and anything else he could find. His feet were shredded. When he finally stumbled into the fort, the men there barely recognized him. Why tell this story in such detail? Because it illustrates something important about the men who opened Wyoming to Euro-American exploitation. They were extraordinarily tough, self-reliant, and willing to take enormous risks. They had to be. The wilderness they entered was unforgiving, and they faced dangers from weather, terrain, animals, and sometimes from native peoples who quite understandably saw them as invaders. John Coulter eventually retired from the mountains, returned to Missouri, married, and settled down to farm. He died in 1812 or 1813, probably from jaundice, still a young man. But his explorations helped map Wyoming and opened the way for the fur trade that would follow. The fur trade era represents a distinct period in Wyoming's history, roughly from 1810 to 1840, when the primary Euro-American presence consisted of trappers, traders, and the native peoples who traded with them. This wasn't yet settlement in the sense of permanent towns and farms. It was an extractive economy focused on one resource: beaver pelts. Why beaver? In Europe and the eastern United States, beaver fur was prized for making felt, which was used to manufacture hats. Beaver fur has tiny barbs on each hair that lock together when compressed, creating a dense, water-resistant felt. Top hats, in particular, were fashionable among the upper classes, and demand was high. A single beaver pelt might sell for several dollars, and a good trapper could take dozens or even hundreds in a season. For men willing to live rough and face the dangers of the wilderness, trapping offered a chance at real money. The system worked like this. Trading companies, based in St. Louis or other frontier towns, would outfit trappers with supplies, equipment, and credit. The trappers, working alone or in small groups, would spend the trapping season, primarily fall and spring when beaver fur was thickest, wading in icy streams, setting traps and processing pelts. They would cache their furs, and then in summer, travel to a predetermined meeting place called a rendezvous. Here they would trade their furs to the company, pay off their debts, and purchase supplies for the next season. The company would transport the furs back east for sale. The rendezvous was also a social event, a chance for trappers who had been isolated for months to meet other men, drink, gamble, tell stories, and generally raise hell. Native peoples would come to the rendezvous too, bringing their own furs to trade and purchasing manufactured goods, knives, axes, pots, blankets, guns, powder, and lead. The rendezvous was part marketplace, part festival, part diplomatic conference. Wyoming hosted several of these rendezvous. The first, in 1825, was held near the present site of Green River, Wyoming. Others followed at various locations along the Green River and in the valleys west of the Wind River Range. The largest was probably the 1833 rendezvous, also on the Green River, which attracted more than 1,000 people, including hundreds of trappers and thousands of native people from several different tribes. What was a rendezvous like? Imagine a sprawling temporary camp spread across a valley. Trappers' shelters, quickly erected and crude, would be interspersed with the tipis of native families. Traders would set up canvas tents to display their goods. There would be the constant smell of wood smoke, cooking meat, horses, and unwashed men. The noise would be tremendous, people speaking multiple languages, English, French, and various native tongues, the sound of drums and singing from native camps, shouts and laughter from card games and wrestling matches, the occasional gunshot as someone showed off their marksmanship or just let off steam. Trading happened, but so did storytelling, competition, and celebration. Men would race horses, test their shooting skills, wrestle, and engage in all sorts of contests. There was a lot of drinking. Traders sold diluted whiskey at outrageous prices, and trappers, who had been without it for months, would often spend all their hard-earned money on a few days of drunkenness. Contemporary accounts describe the scene as part carnival, part chaos. The trappers themselves were a diverse bunch. Many were Americans from the frontier regions of Missouri, Kentucky, and Tennessee, but there were also French Canadians, men who had been involved in the fur trade farther north and brought their skills southward. There were Spaniards and Mexicans from New Mexico. There were Native Americans, both men who had fully integrated into the trapping life, and those who participated more occasionally. And there were men of mixed heritage, products of the intermarriage that was common on the frontier. Many trappers took native wives, either through formal marriage or more casual arrangements. These relationships could be exploitative, certainly, but they could also be genuine partnerships. A native wife brought crucial skills. She could process hides, make clothing, gather and prepare food, and often spoke multiple languages, serving as an interpreter and cultural mediator. Her kinship networks could provide safety and trading opportunities. Some of these marriages lasted for decades, others were temporary, ending when the trapper moved on or the woman chose to leave. The most famous mountain man associated with Wyoming is probably Jim Bridger, who first came to the region in 1822 as a young man of 18, hired by William Ashley's fur trading company. Bridger would spend the next 4 decades in the Rocky Mountains, becoming legendary for his knowledge of the region's geography, his survival skills, and his storytelling. Bridger is often credited with being the first Euro-American to see the Great Salt Lake, though this claim is disputed. What's certain is that he traveled extensively throughout Wyoming, learning routes and landmarks that he would later use when he worked as a guide. He apparently visited the Yellowstone region and, like Coulter before him, told stories about geysers and hot springs that many people dismissed as exaggerations. Bridger was illiterate. He never learned to read or write, but he had an exceptional memory and a gift for description. He could draw accurate maps in the dirt and guide people through terrain he hadn't seen in years. Later in life, he worked as a guide for government expeditions, military campaigns, and emigrant parties, his knowledge proving invaluable to those trying to cross Wyoming's difficult terrain. He was also famous for telling tall tales, stretching the truth for entertainment. He would tell greenhorns about petrified forests in Yellowstone, where the trees, the birds, and even the birds' songs were petrified, or about a mountain of pure glass that was so transparent you couldn't see it and would run right into it, or about rivers that flowed so fast they heated up from friction and would cook a fish even as you caught it. These stories were told with such a straight face that listeners couldn't always tell when he was pulling their leg. In 1843, Bridger established a trading post called Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming, along Black's Fork of the Green River. This would become an important stop for emigrants heading west on the Oregon Trail, but we'll come to that soon. For now, it's worth noting that Bridger was making a transition from trapping to trading and guiding, a shift that many mountain men made as the fur trade declined. And decline it did, relatively quickly. By the late 1830s, beaver populations had been severely depleted by decades of intensive trapping. At the same time, fashion changed. Silk hats began replacing beaver felt hats in popularity. The economic basis for the Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed. The last rendezvous was held in 1840. Many trappers left the mountains, returning to settlements in the east, or finding new lines of work. Some, like Bridger, stayed on as guides, traders, or scouts. Others married into native communities and lived out their lives in the West. The fur trade era left a lasting mark on Wyoming despite its relatively brief span. The trappers had learned the geography, mapping rivers, passes, and valleys that would later guide emigrants and railroads. They had established relationships, both friendly and hostile, with native peoples that would shape later interactions. They had given names to landmarks, names that often stuck: the Teton Range, named by French trappers who saw the peaks and thought of, well, you can imagine what shape they saw. The Green River, the Sweetwater River, South Pass, names that would appear on maps and in guidebooks for generations. The trails the trappers followed often traced routes native peoples had used for centuries, but the trappers widened them, made them passable for horses and pack mules, and recorded them in journals and on maps. These trails would soon carry a very different kind of traveler, families in covered wagons, heading west not to trap or trade, but to settle, to claim land, to build permanent homes. The great overland migrations that crossed Wyoming in the middle decades of the 19th century rank among the largest voluntary mass movements in American history. Between the early 1840s and the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, something like 400,000 people traveled west on what became known as the Oregon Trail, with branches leading to California and Utah. Most of these travelers passed through Wyoming, following a corridor that ran along the North Platte and Sweetwater rivers, over South Pass in the Wind River Range, and down to Fort Bridger and beyond. Why did they go? The motivations were as varied as the people themselves. Some were seeking economic opportunity, cheap or free land where they could farm and raise families. Some were fleeing economic hard times in the East. Some were drawn by the promise of gold, especially after the California gold rush began in 1849. Some sought religious freedom, particularly the Mormon emigrants heading to Utah to build a new Zion under the leadership of Brigham Young. Some were simply restless, attracted by the adventure and possibility of a new life in a new place. The journey was daunting, from jumping off points along the Missouri River, places like Independence or St. Joseph, to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, or the gold fields of California. The distance was roughly 2,000 miles. The trip would take 5 to 6 months under good conditions, longer if you encountered delays. You had to time it carefully, leave too early, and there wouldn't be grass for your oxen or cattle. Leave too late, and you might get caught by early snows in the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, as the ill-fated Donner Party discovered with tragic consequences in 1846. Most emigrants traveled in wagon trains, groups of families who banded together for mutual aid and protection. They would elect a captain and organize themselves with rules and responsibilities. Traveling in a group offered many advantages: more people to stand guard, to help with repairs, to share knowledge, but it also created friction. People came from different backgrounds, held different values, and had different ideas about how fast to travel, when to rest, what risks to take. Arguments were common, and wagon trains sometimes split up over disagreements. The wagons themselves were usually not the large, heavy Conestoga wagons you might imagine. Those were used for freight on eastern roads. The prairie schooner, as it was called, was lighter, with a wooden bed about 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, covered with a canvas bonnet stretched over bent wooden hoops. This wagon would carry everything the family owned: food, tools, clothing, furniture, seeds, perhaps books or other valued possessions. There was rarely room to ride inside. Most people walked alongside the wagon for the entire journey. The wagons were typically pulled by teams of oxen, usually 3 or 4 yoke, meaning 6 to 8 animals. Why oxen rather than horses or mules? Oxen were stronger, more patient, and could survive on rougher forage. They were also less attractive to thieves, particularly native horse raiders, who prized horses but cared little for slow, plodding oxen. The downside was speed. Oxen walked at about 2 miles per hour. A good day's travel might cover 15 miles. Some days you made less, especially when crossing difficult terrain, or when you had to stop for repairs, rest, or to wait out bad weather. What did emigrants eat on the trail? The basic staples were flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, and beans. These were foods that would keep for months if stored properly. Most families aimed to bring about 200 pounds of flour per person, plus 50 pounds of bacon, and smaller amounts of other items. This sounds like a lot, but stretched over 5 or 6 months, it was barely adequate. The diet was monotonous. Biscuits or bread baked in a Dutch oven, fried bacon, beans cooked with bacon fat, coffee that was often more grounds than liquid by the end of the journey. Emigrants supplemented this diet when they could. Men would hunt for game, antelope, deer, sometimes buffalo once they reached the plains. Women and children would gather wild berries, greens, and roots. At trading posts and forts along the way, emigrants could purchase supplies, though prices were often exorbitant. A trader at Fort Laramie or Fort Bridger knew he had a captive market and charged accordingly. The trail across Wyoming followed a fairly well-defined route, but calling it a road would be generous. In many places, it was just ruts worn into the prairie by thousands of wagon wheels. In places where the ground was soft or sandy, these ruts could become quite deep. Where the trail crossed rock, you can still see grooves worn into stone by the wheels of thousands of wagons. These ruts remain visible today at several sites in Wyoming, physical traces of one of the great migrations in human history. Entering Wyoming from the east, emigrants would follow the North Platte River. This was relatively easy terrain, rolling prairie with adequate water and grass. The first major landmark was Scotts Bluff, actually in present-day Nebraska, but visible for miles. This towering formation rose dramatically from the plains and served as a reassuring marker that the travelers were on the right track. Further west, in Wyoming, came another famous landmark, Register Cliff, near present-day Guernsey. This soft sandstone bluff along the North Platte served as a natural message board. Immigrants would carve or paint their names, dates, and sometimes messages on the cliff face. Thousands did this, and many of the inscriptions remain visible today. A roster of people who passed this way: J. Wilson, 1852, Mary Brown, heading to Oregon, June 1850. Standing before these inscriptions now, you're looking at messages from people long dead, brief assertions that they existed, they were here, they were part of this great movement west. Not far from Register Cliff is another feature that challenged the emigrants: Windlass Hill, a steep descent to the North Platte. The slope was so sharp that wagons couldn't simply roll down. Instead, emigrants would lock the wheels with chains and use ropes wound around trees or stakes to lower each wagon slowly. It was hard, dangerous work. Ropes could break, wagons could tip, people could be injured, but this was one of the unavoidable obstacles on the trail, one of many places where the journey tested the emigrants' ingenuity and determination. Fort Laramie, Established as a trading post in 1834 and later purchased by the US Army, was the first major stop on the trail through Wyoming. For emigrants who had been traveling for weeks since leaving the Missouri River, Fort Laramie represented civilization, however rough. They could purchase supplies, have wagon repairs done by a blacksmith, trade worn-out animals for fresh ones, and rest for a few days. They could also post and receive letters, as the fort served as an informal mail drop. Fort Laramie was more than just a supply depot, though. It was a diplomatic and military center, a place where the US government attempted to manage its relationships with the native peoples of the region. In 1851, Fort Laramie was the site of a major treaty council, an attempt to bring peace to the plains and establish clear boundaries between tribal territories. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 brought together representatives from multiple tribes: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Shoshone, and others. It was an extraordinary gathering, perhaps 10,000 native people camped near the fort, by far the largest assembly of Plains tribes ever recorded. Bannerman's goals were to secure safe passage for emigrants on the Oregon Trail, to define tribal territories, and to allow the construction of roads and military posts. In exchange, the government promised to pay annuities, annual payments of goods and money, and to keep emigrants from harassing or trespassing on native lands outside the narrow trail corridor. The various tribes agreed to peace with each other and with the United States. Boundaries were drawn on maps, though these boundaries often didn't reflect the complex, overlapping patterns of actual land use. The treaty was well-intentioned, perhaps, but it was built on misunderstandings. The US negotiators assumed that the tribal representatives had the authority to bind their entire nations to the agreement, but Plains societies didn't work that way. Chiefs didn't have absolute authority. A chief who agreed to terms couldn't force his warriors to comply. Moreover, the boundaries drawn on maps meant little to people whose lives depended on following buffalo herds wherever they roamed. Within a few years, the treaty had effectively collapsed. Conflicts between emigrants and native peoples increased. The US Army began establishing more forts and sending more troops. The stage was being set for decades of warfare. But let's stay with the emigrants for now, following their journey westward from Fort Laramie. The next major landmark was Independence Rock, about 50 miles southwest of present-day Casper. This massive granite dome rises about 130 feet above the Sweetwater River Valley and covers nearly 30 acres. It became one of the most famous landmarks on the entire Oregon Trail. Independence Rock got its name because emigrants aimed to reach it by Independence Day, July 4th. If you made it there by then, you were on schedule to cross the mountains before snow closed the passes. Like Register Cliff, Independence Rock became covered with inscriptions. Emigrants carved their names with chisels or painted them with axle grease mixed with gunpowder to make it dark and visible. Some of these inscriptions are quite elaborate, with flowing script and decorative flourishes. Others are simple and crude. The rock became known as the Great Register of the Desert. Why did people feel compelled to leave their names? Part of it was simply the impulse to mark your passage, to leave evidence that you were here, but there was probably also a deeper anxiety at work. The journey was dangerous. Many wouldn't survive, and leaving your name was a way of asserting your existence, of saying, I lived, I mattered, remember me. And the dangers were real. Disease was the biggest killer. Cholera, spread by contaminated water, could sweep through a wagon train, killing people within hours of the first symptoms. Accidental deaths were common. People were crushed by wagon wheels, kicked by animals, drowned crossing rivers, or killed by accidental gunshots. Childbirth on the trail was dangerous. Both mother and infant faced elevated risks. Some people simply wore out, the endless walking in harsh weather proving too much for the elderly or the already ill. Native attacks, though they loom large in popular imagination, were actually a relatively minor cause of death. Most interactions between emigrants and native peoples were peaceful, often involving trade. Native people would visit wagon trains to trade buffalo robes, moccasins, or fresh meat for manufactured goods, particularly guns, ammunition, and whiskey. Some served as guides or helped emigrants ford rivers. Violence happened, Certainly, but it was the exception rather than the rule, at least in the early years of the migration. As the years passed and the number of emigrants increased, tensions rose. The great wagon trains damaged the prairie ecosystem. Emigrants' livestock overgrazed the grass, depleted the firewood, and scared away game animals. From the native perspective, these weren't just visitors passing through, they were an invasion, a threat to the resources that sustained native life. As buffalo populations declined, partly due to overhunting by emigrants and commercial hunters, native peoples faced growing hardship and anger. Continuing west from Independence Rock, emigrants would pass through Devil's Gate, a narrow gorge where the Sweetwater River cuts through a rock ridge. The opening is only about 30 feet wide, but more than 300 feet deep, a dramatic geological feature that must have seemed almost supernatural to travelers. Most wagon trains didn't try to go through the gate itself, instead taking a more gradual route around the ridge, but it was an impressive sight. The trail followed the Sweetwater River Valley westward, climbing gradually toward the Continental Divide. This stretch of the journey was challenging. Water was generally available from the river, but fuel became scarce. The emigrants had left the timbered country behind, and in many places, the only fuel available was sagebrush or buffalo chips. Dried dung. Women particularly disliked gathering buffalo chips for fuel, though they got used to it. The chips actually burned well once dried, producing steady heat without much smoke. The Continental Divide, the ridge that separates waters flowing toward the Atlantic from those flowing toward the Pacific, might seem like it should be a dramatic mountain pass. At South Pass, though, it's nothing like that. South Pass is a broad, gentle saddle in the landscape, so gradual that many emigrants didn't realize they had crossed it. At its highest point, the elevation is about 7,500 feet, and the grade is easy. This was crucial. South Pass was one of the few places where wagons could cross the Continental Divide without having to be disassembled and carried or lowered down cliffs. Native peoples had used South Pass for centuries, and trappers had rediscovered it in the early 19th century. Robert Stewart, a member of an 1812 expedition, is often credited as the first Euro-American to cross it heading eastward. But it was only with the great migrations of the 1840s that South Pass became truly famous, the gateway through the mountains, the key to the west. After South Pass, the trail descended toward the Green River Valley and Fort Bridger. Here, emigrants heading to California or Utah would continue southwest, while those bound for Oregon would turn northwest toward Fort Hall in present-day Idaho. Fort Bridger offered the last chance to rest and resupply before tackling the final and often most difficult stages of the journey. Jim Bridger had chosen his location well. The fort sat at a crossroads near good water and grass, in a valley sheltered from the worst weather. He and his partner Louis Vasquez traded with both emigrants and native peoples, operated a blacksmith shop, and provided fresh animals to replace those worn out by the journey. Prices were high, but emigrants had little choice. Bridger also hired himself out as a guide and shared his knowledge of routes and conditions ahead. The Mormon emigrants deserve special mention because they came in such numbers and with such organization. After the murder of their founder, Joseph Smith, in 1844, the Latter-day Saints faced increasing persecution in Illinois and Missouri. In 1846, under the leadership of Brigham Young, they began a mass exodus westward, seeking a place where they could practice their religion without interference. The Mormon Pioneer Company of 1847, led by Young himself, followed the established Oregon Trail through Wyoming, though they often stayed on the north side of the Platte River to avoid conflicts with other emigrants. When they reached the Green River area, they met Moses Harris, a mountain man who told them about the Great Salt Lake Valley. Young decided this would be their destination, a desert valley that nobody else wanted, where they could build their Zion. That first company of 148 people arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in July 1847. Young, sick with fever, looked out over the valley and reportedly said, "This is the place." It's become one of the famous quotes in Mormon history, though whether he actually said it exactly that way is debated. What's certain is that the Mormons began immediately to irrigate, plant crops, and build. Over the next 2 decades, Tens of thousands of Mormon converts would follow the same trail through Wyoming. The Mormon migration was remarkable for its organization. The church established a perpetual emigrating fund to help poor converts afford the journey. They set up way stations and supply depots. They sent experienced guides back each year to lead new companies. They even organized handcart companies, groups of emigrants who couldn't afford wagons and instead pulled and pushed their belongings in handcarts, essentially large wheelbarrows. Some of these handcart companies ran into disaster. In 1856, two companies, the Willie and Martin handcart companies, left too late in the season. Winter storms caught them in Wyoming in October and November. Hundreds died from cold, starvation, and exhaustion. Rescue parties sent from Salt Lake City saved the survivors, but the tragedy marked one of the worst disasters of the overland trails. The various trails through Wyoming, the Oregon Trail, California Trail, Mormon Trail, and others, all represented more than just routes of travel. They were corridors of culture contact, transformation, and conflict. The emigrants who passed through saw Wyoming as an obstacle to be crossed, not a destination. Few stopped here. Those who did were usually forced to by circumstance, broken wagons, dead animals, illness, or exhaustion. Graves line the trail, unmarked or marked with crude wooden crosses that have long since rotted away. Think about what it meant to pass through. You spent months in this landscape. You saw its beauty and harshness, its storms and sunsets, its wildlife and desolation, but you weren't trying to understand it or learn to live with it. You were just trying to get across it as quickly as possible. This transitory relationship would shape how many Americans viewed Wyoming for generations. A place you went through, not a place you went to. Yet some did stay, and their reasons for staying were tied to the trails themselves. The presence of thousands of emigrants each summer created economic opportunities. You could make money supplying them with fresh animals, food, repairs, or guidance. Trading posts became more elaborate. Ferries were established at major river crossings. Entrepreneurs built bridges and charged tolls. Small settlements appeared around these service points. The U.S. Army also saw Wyoming's strategic importance. Controlling the trails meant controlling Western migration and communication. Between the 1840s and 1860s, the Army established a series of forts across Wyoming. We've already mentioned Fort Laramie, but others followed: Fort Bridger, Fort Caspar, Fort Fetterman, Fort Phil Kearny, and more. These weren't forts in the traditional sense of massive stone walls and towers. They were usually just collections of buildings, barracks, stables, storehouses, and officers' quarters, arranged around a parade ground, and sometimes protected by a wooden stockade. The forts served multiple purposes. They protected emigrants and mail routes from attacks. They served as bases for military campaigns against native peoples. They were supply depots and communication hubs, and they were sites of diplomacy, places where government officials met with tribal leaders to negotiate treaties or simply to maintain some kind of relationship. Life at these frontier forts was often tedious. Soldiers spent more time building, maintaining, and drilling than fighting. The duty was unpopular, the pay low, the conditions harsh. Desertion was common. Many soldiers were recent immigrants, Irish and German men who had joined the army because they couldn't find other work. The officers were often West Point graduates, serving their required time before resigning to pursue civilian careers. A few were career military men, but even they found frontier duty trying. Relations between the soldiers and nearby native peoples were complex. Sometimes they traded peacefully, sometimes there were tensions but no violence, sometimes there were raids, skirmishes, or full battles. Much depended on local conditions, individual personalities, and larger political currents. A wise post commander tried to maintain good relations with nearby tribes, employing native scouts, allowing trade, and avoiding unnecessary provocations. A foolish or aggressive commander could start a war. And wars did come, devastating conflicts that mark the 1860s and 1870s as perhaps the darkest period in Wyoming's history, at least from the native perspective. These were the wars that would break the power of the Plains tribes, force them onto reservations, and open Wyoming to full-scale American settlement. The conflicts had deep roots. The flood of emigrants, the establishment of forts, the construction of telegraph lines, all represented encroachment on native lands and disruption of native life, but several specific events escalated tensions dramatically. One was the discovery of gold in Montana in the early 1860s. Prospectors wanted a direct route from the Oregon Trail to the Montana gold fields. The most direct route, the Bozeman Trail, ran north from Fort Laramie through the Powder River country, the heart of hunting grounds claimed by the Lakota and Cheyenne. The tribes made clear they opposed this new trail. It would bring more emigrants, disrupt the buffalo, and violate territory that had been recognized, at least nominally, in the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. But the US government, under pressure from miners and settlers, decided to open the trail anyway. In 1866, the Army began construction of forts along the Bozeman Trail to protect travelers. This decision led directly to what Euro-Americans called Red Cloud's War, named after the Oglala Lakota leader who emerged as the primary native military strategist, though many other leaders and warriors from multiple tribes participated. The war consisted of 2 years of raids, ambushes, and occasional larger battles. Native forces attacked wood-cutting parties, mail carriers, and small detachments of soldiers. They besieged the forts, never trying to overrun them, but making it dangerous for anyone to venture outside the walls. The most famous incident of Red Cloud's War was the Fetterman Fight, December 21, 1866. Captain William Fetterman led a force of 80 men from Fort Phil Kearny, near present-day Story, Wyoming. His mission was to relieve a wood-cutting party that was under attack. Fetterman had reportedly boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation. On this day, he got his chance to test that boast. Native warriors, probably numbering around 2,000 from Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho bands, had set an ambush. A small group of decoys, led by a young Oglala warrior named Crazy Horse, lured Fetterman's command away from the fort and over a ridge. Once Fetterman was out of sight of the fort and extended from his base, the main native force attacked from all sides. The fight was short and brutal. Fetterman and all 80 of his men were killed. It was the Army's worst defeat in the West, up to that time. News of the Fetterman Massacre, as it was called in the newspapers, shocked the nation. The Army sent reinforcements and more experienced officers, but the Native Coalition continued their successful campaign. In August 1867, near Fort Phil Kearny, another engagement showed the effectiveness of Native tactics and the ability of soldiers to defend themselves when properly prepared. This was the Wagon Box Fight. A wood-cutting party from the fort was working in a meadow several miles from the post, protected by a small detachment of soldiers under Captain James Powell. Powell had learned from the Fetterman disaster. He had his men remove the wheels from their wagon boxes and arrange them in a rough circle, creating a fortified position. Crucially, his men were armed with new Springfield breech-loading rifles, which could be fired much faster than the old muzzle-loaders. When a large force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors attacked, expecting an easy victory like the Fetterman fight, they found themselves facing unexpected firepower. Powell's men, only about 30 soldiers and a few civilians, held off hundreds of attackers for several hours, firing so rapidly that the warriors couldn't get close. When reinforcements arrived from the fort, the native forces withdrew. Accounts differ on casualties, but the soldiers' losses were light, while native losses were significant enough to make a major assault on such a position seem too costly. Despite this defensive victory, the broader strategic situation favored the Native Coalition. The Bozeman Trail remained too dangerous to use. The forts were isolated and besieged. Maintaining them required enormous expense and effort. In 1868, the US government agreed to negotiate. The result was the Second Fort Laramie Treaty, one of the most significant agreements between the United States and Native peoples. The 1868 treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, covering much of present-day South Dakota west of the Missouri River. It recognized the Powder River country, including parts of Wyoming and Montana, as unceded Indian territory, where the Lakota and their allies could continue to hunt. No whites would be allowed to settle there. The Bozeman Trail would be closed. The forts would be abandoned. In exchange, the tribes agreed to make peace, to allow the construction of railroads on certain routes, and to accept the eventual settlement of native people on the reservation, with the government providing rations, goods, and support for those willing to take up farming. Some native leaders signed the treaty. Red Cloud, after initially refusing, eventually added his mark. Others, including Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, never signed and never accepted the treaty's legitimacy. The army abandoned the forts along the Bozeman Trail in summer 1868. As the soldiers marched away from Fort Phil Kearny, Cheyenne warriors set it ablaze, burning it to the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed like native peoples had won a significant victory, turned back American expansion, and secured their lands and way of life. But this victory was temporary and illusory. The forces driving American expansion westward were too strong, too persistent, and too numerous. The Transcontinental Railroad was approaching completion, and it would transform everything. The Pacific Railroad Act, signed by President Lincoln in 1862, authorized construction of a railroad connecting the existing Eastern Rail network to California. 2 companies would build it, the Central Pacific starting in Sacramento and building eastward, and the Union Pacific starting from Omaha and building westward. They would meet somewhere in the middle, and Congress offered substantial incentives to both companies: loans, land grants, and the prestige of connecting the continent. Construction began during the Civil War, but proceeded slowly at first. After the war ended in 1865, both companies accelerated their efforts, employing thousands of workers, many of them Civil War veterans, Irish immigrants, and Chinese laborers. The building of the railroad was an epic undertaking, celebrated at the time and since as a triumph of American engineering and determination. For Wyoming, the arrival of the railroad marked a fundamental transformation. The Union Pacific entered Wyoming in 1867, crossing from Nebraska into the southeastern corner of the territory, which had been officially organized in 1868. The route followed the relatively flat terrain along the southern part of the state, passing through or near locations that would become some of Wyoming's major towns. Cheyenne, now the state capital, was founded in July 1867 as the Union Pacific prepared to extend its tracks west from Julesburg, Colorado. The site was chosen for its strategic location and access to water. Within weeks, thousands of people descended on what had been empty prairie. A tent city appeared overnight, housing workers, merchants, gamblers, prostitutes, saloon keepers, and the whole motley collection of people who followed the construction of the railroad. These temporary construction camps were known as Hell on Wheels, and they lived up to the name. Imagine a town that appeared in a matter of days, existed for a few months, and then largely disappeared as the railroad moved on, and most people followed it. Law was minimal or absent. Violence was common. Gambling and drinking were the primary entertainments. Fortunes were made and lost. Some people worked hard, saved money, and moved on to better things. Others were fleeced by gamblers, robbed, or simply drank themselves into oblivion. Cheyenne was fortunate in that it didn't disappear when the railroad moved on. Its location made it a logical division point for the railroad and a departure point for stage lines heading north to the Montana goldfields. It became the territorial capital in 1869. Within a few years, it had evolved from a wild railroad town into a relatively stable community with schools, churches, newspapers, and the beginnings of civic institutions. Other towns along the railroad's route had similar stories. Laramie, founded in 1868, was named after Jacques Laramie, a French or French-Canadian trapper who had worked in the area in the early 19th century. Rawlins was named after John Rawlins, a Union general and friend of President Grant. Green River, Rock Springs, Evanston, each town owed its existence to the railroad, either as a construction camp that survived, or as a planned stop for water, coal, or servicing locomotives. The railroad reached the summit of the Laramie Range in 1868, an elevation of over 8,000 feet, one of the highest points on any railroad in the world at that time. Workers faced brutal conditions, bitter cold in winter, scorching heat in summer, thin air at high elevations, and attacks by native war parties who correctly saw the railroad as a threat to their way of life. In Wyoming, attacks on railroad workers and infrastructure were fairly common in 1867 and 1868. Small parties of Cheyenne or Lakota warriors would raid construction camps, run off livestock, tear up tracks, or ambush supply trains. The army provided protection when it could, but guarding hundreds of miles of track and scattered work camps was nearly impossible. One dramatic incident occurred in August 1867 at Plum Creek, just east of the Wyoming border in Nebraska. A Cheyenne war party removed a section of rail and positioned ties on the track, then waited in ambush. A handcar with several workers came along first and derailed, killing most of the men. Then a freight train approached. It struck the obstruction and derailed spectacularly, killing the engineer and fireman. The warriors looted the wreckage, setting fire to the rail cars, and disappeared before troops could respond. It was a small victory, but a symbolic one, demonstrating that the railroad was vulnerable. Despite these attacks, construction continued. The economic and political will behind the project was too strong to be stopped by raids. The two companies, Central Pacific and Union Pacific, raced toward each other, each trying to build as many miles as possible, since they were paid by the mile. The competition became almost absurd, with grading crews from both companies passing each other, each building roadbed in opposite directions for the same route, hoping their company would be the one to lay track there first. Finally, on May 10, 1869, the two lines met at Promontory Summit in Utah Territory, just west of the Wyoming border. A ceremony was held, speeches were made, and a golden spike was driven, symbolically completing the Transcontinental Railroad. Telegraph lines, which ran alongside the railroad, transmitted news of the event instantly to both coasts. For the first time, you could travel from New York to San Francisco entirely by rail, a journey that took less than a week instead of the months required by wagon or ship. For Wyoming and the West, the impact was immediate and profound. The railroad made it possible to ship goods, people, and resources in quantities and at speeds previously unimaginable. Cattle could be driven to the railroad and shipped to slaughterhouses in Chicago. Minerals and coal could be extracted and sent to eastern markets. Manufactured goods could be brought in from the east. Settlers could reach Wyoming quickly and relatively comfortably compared to the hardships of the overland trail. The railroad also made it much easier for the army to move troops and supplies. Campaigns against native peoples that once required months of preparation could now be launched quickly. Forts could be reinforced rapidly. The military balance shifted dramatically in favor of the United States, not because of superior tactics or courage, but because of superior logistics and industrial capacity. For Wyoming's native peoples, the railroad represented an existential threat. The buffalo herds, already under pressure from overhunting, were split by the railroad. Hunters could easily ship hides east, creating a commercial market for buffalo extermination. In the early 1870s, this commercial hunting reached its peak. Professional hunters with powerful rifles would position themselves and shoot buffalo systematically, sometimes killing dozens or even hundreds in a day. The meat was usually left to rot, only the hides were taken. This wasn't subsistence hunting or even sport hunting, it was industrial-scale slaughter, and it was often encouraged by military officials who recognized that destroying the buffalo meant destroying the economic base of Plains native peoples. General Philip Sheridan reportedly said that buffalo hunters deserved medals for doing more to solve the Indian question than the army had done in 30 years. Whether or not he said exactly that, the sentiment was shared by many officials. Kill the buffalo, and you force the native peoples onto reservations, make them dependent on government rations, and open the land for white settlement. Within 2 decades, the great herds were nearly gone. Estimates suggest that there were perhaps 30 million buffalo in North America before European contact. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained. It was one of the greatest wildlife catastrophes in recorded history, and it was largely deliberate. The destruction of the buffalo made continuing the traditional way of life impossible. Starvation became a real threat for native bands that tried to remain free, hunting in their traditional territories. The choice became stark: go to the reservations and accept whatever the government offered, or starve and be hunted down by the army. Most eventually chose the reservations, though not without resistance. The 1870s saw continued conflict, particularly in the Powder River country. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse led bands that refused to accept the reservation. The army launched multiple campaigns to force them to submit. This culminated in the Great Sioux War of 1876, sparked by the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, which were part of the Great Sioux Reservation and supposedly protected by the 1868 treaty. The government demanded that the Lakotas sell the Black Hills. When they refused, the government declared that all Lakota must report to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. This was winter on the northern plains, when travel was difficult or impossible. Many bands didn't receive the message. Others received it, but ignored it. They weren't going to report to the reservation in the middle of winter just because the government demanded it. In spring 1876, the army launched a three-pronged campaign into the Powder River and Bighorn country. One of these columns was led by Colonel George Armstrong Custer, and his fate is well known. On June 25, 1876, Custer's 7th Cavalry attacked a large encampment of Lakota and Cheyenne along the Little Bighorn River in Montana. The camp was much larger than Custer expected, perhaps the largest gathering of native warriors ever assembled. Custer split his force, a tactical error, and his immediate command of about 210 men was surrounded and annihilated. Custer and all his men were killed in what became known as Custer's Last Stand, or from the native perspective, the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The victory was spectacular, but it was also the beginning of the end for the independent Plains tribes. The American public was outraged by Custer's defeat. The army intensified its campaigns. More troops were sent west. The native bands were relentlessly pursued through the following winter, given no rest, attacked in their camps, their horses captured, their supplies destroyed. Starvation and exhaustion did what direct combat often couldn't. By 1877, most of the bands had surrendered and moved to reservations. Crazy Horse brought his people in to Fort Robinson in Nebraska in May 1877. A few months later, under circumstances that remain controversial, he was killed while allegedly trying to escape from the guardhouse. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with a small group of followers, remaining there until 1881, when hunger finally forced him to return and surrender. The Northern Cheyenne faced perhaps the most tragic fate. After surrendering, they were sent to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma, far from their homeland. The climate, the disease, the despair, all took a terrible toll. In 1878, a group of Northern Cheyenne, under leaders Dull Knife and Little Wolf, decided they would rather die trying to return home than remain in Oklahoma. About 300 people, mostly women, children, and old people with only a handful of warriors, broke out and began an epic fighting retreat toward their homeland. They traveled more than 1,000 miles, pursued by thousands of soldiers, fighting multiple skirmishes, splitting into smaller groups to evade pursuit. Little Wolf's group eventually made it to Montana and was allowed to settle on the Tongue River. Dull Knife's group was captured in Nebraska and imprisoned at Fort Robinson. When they were told they would be sent back to Oklahoma, they refused. The army cut off their food, water, and heat in the middle of winter, trying to force them to comply. After nearly a week, the Cheyenne broke out in a desperate escape attempt. Soldiers fired on them in the darkness. More than half were killed or recaptured. Dull Knife and a few others escaped, and eventually found refuge with Red Cloud's people. This tragedy finally convinced the government to allow the Northern Cheyenne to remain in the north. In 1884, they were granted a reservation in Montana. It was a small victory born of immense suffering. By 1880, the Indian Wars in Wyoming were essentially over. The native peoples had been confined to reservations. The Wind River Reservation in west-central Wyoming became home to the Eastern Shoshone, who who had generally been allied with the United States during the wars with the Lakota and Cheyenne. Later, the northern Arapaho, traditional enemies of the Shoshone, were also settled on the Wind River Reservation, creating a complex and sometimes difficult situation. Life on the reservations bore little resemblance to the free, mobile existence of the past. People were expected to become farmers, though the land was often unsuitable for agriculture, and the government rarely provided adequate tools, seed, or instruction. Rations were supposed to compensate for the loss of hunting, but they were often inadequate, of poor quality, or simply didn't arrive. Corruption among Indian agents was common. Supplies meant for native families would be sold for personal profit. The government also launched a systematic campaign to destroy native cultures and assimilate people into white American society. Traditional ceremonies like the sun dance were banned. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, sometimes hundreds of miles away, where they were forced to cut their hair, wear Euro-American clothing, speak only English, and abandon their cultural practices. The stated goal was to kill the Indian and save the man, a phrase attributed to Richard Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. These policies caused immense trauma that echoed through generations, yet native peoples survived. They maintained their languages, often in secret. They continued ceremonies in hidden places. They adapted, finding ways to preserve essential aspects of their cultures while navigating the imposed system. The story of Wyoming's native peoples didn't end with the reservation era. It continued and continues still, though that's a story we'll return to later. With the native peoples confined to reservations and the railroad providing easy access, Wyoming was now open for the taking. The question was, what would people do with this vast, arid, often harsh landscape? The answer came riding on horseback and trailing long horns. This was the beginning of Wyoming's Great Cattle Era, the period from roughly 1870 to the early 1890s, when the open range supported enormous herds and cattlemen built what seemed like an empire on grass and beef. The cattle industry in Wyoming grew from several converging factors. After the Civil War, Texas had millions of semi-wild longhorn cattle, descendants of Spanish cattle that had been running loose for generations. These animals were tough, able to survive on poor forage, and could walk long distances, but in Texas they had little value. There was more cattle than the local market could absorb. In the eastern United States, meanwhile, demand for beef was high, and prices were good, driven by growing industrial cities full of workers who needed feeding. The challenge was getting Texas cattle to eastern markets. The solution was the long drive, herding cattle hundreds of miles north to railroads in Kansas, where they could be shipped east. Some of these cattle didn't make it all the way to Kansas. Drovers discovered that if they brought cattle to the rich grasslands of Wyoming and let them graze for a season, the animals would gain weight and be worth more. Wyoming's high plains, with their nutritious native grasses and relatively mild winters, at least by the standards of the northern plains, proved ideal for fattening cattle. At first, this was a temporary arrangement. Cattle would be brought up from Texas in spring, graze through summer and fall, then driven to the railroad in late fall for shipment. But gradually, some ranchers decided to keep cattle in Wyoming year-round. They found that if winter wasn't too severe, cattle could survive on the open range, pawing through snow to reach grass. No need for expensive hay or shelter, just turn the cattle loose and let them fend for themselves. This was open-range ranching, and it seemed almost too good to be true. The land was public domain, free for anyone to use. You didn't need to own the land to graze cattle on it. You just needed to own cattle. Startup costs were relatively low. Buy some cattle, hire a few cowboys to watch them, establish a rough base of operations, and you were a rancher. If the weather cooperated and the cattle thrived, you could make a fortune. And fortunes were made, at least on paper, and in some cases in reality. The boom attracted investors from the East and from Europe, particularly from Britain and Scotland. Foreign and Eastern investors poured money into Wyoming cattle operations, often in absentia, hiring managers to run their ranches while they collected dividends. The returns seemed spectacular. 20, 30, even 40% annually, according to some reports. These reports were often exaggerated, sometimes fraudulently so. The way open-range ranching worked made accurate accounting almost impossible. How many cattle did you actually have? You didn't know precisely. Cattle ranged over vast distances, often mixing with other herds. Twice a year, in spring and fall roundups, ranchers would gather cattle, sort them by brand, count them, and separate out those ready for market. The rest would be turned loose again. Calves born during the year would be branded with their mother's brand, establishing ownership. This system worked only if everyone respected brands and followed the unwritten rules of the range. For the most part, in the early years, they did. A code of honor governed range behavior. You didn't brand another man's calf. You helped neighbors during roundups. You offered hospitality to travelers. Water sources were shared. Range wars were bad for everyone, so disputes were usually settled without violence. But the system contained the seeds of its own destruction. With no limits on how many cattle you could graze on public land, there was every incentive to bring in more cattle. As the number of animals increased, the range became overgrazed, grass quality declined. Cattle didn't gain weight as quickly, but rather than reduce herd sizes, many ranchers simply brought in more cattle, trying to compensate for lower weight gains with higher volume. Competition for range intensified. Newcomers, often small operators without much capital, homesteaders who ran a few cattle on the side, or ambitious cowboys who had saved enough to start their own herds, began claiming grazing areas. The big cattlemen, who had been first on the scene and controlled the cattlemen's associations, viewed these newcomers with suspicion and resentment. The big cattlemen called the small operators rustlers, claiming they built their herds by stealing cattle. Sometimes this was true. Cattle theft did happen, and it was easier to get away with when cattle ranged freely, and branding wasn't always done carefully. But often the charge of rustling was simply a way of delegitimizing small operators who were competing for grass and water. Conflicts escalated. In some cases, cattle detectives, hired guns working for the big cattle companies, would hunt down suspected rustlers and dispense rough justice, meaning murder. The most notorious case was the lynching of Ella Watson and James Averill in 1889 near the Sweetwater River. Watson, who owned a small ranch, and Averill, who ran a roadhouse and was an outspoken critic of the big cattlemen, were accused of cattle rustling, seized by a group of 6 prominent cattlemen and their hired hands, and hanged from a tree. Watson became known in sensationalized newspaper accounts as Cattle Kate, supposedly a prostitute who accepted stolen cattle as payment, though the real story was far more complex and less salacious. The lynching was clearly murder, done to intimidate small operators and eliminate vocal critics. The 6 men were arrested but never tried. Witnesses disappeared or refused to testify, possibly intimidated, possibly bribed. The case became a symbol of the power and ruthlessness of the big cattlemen. But the big cattlemen's dominance was being challenged not just by small operators, but by environmental and economic realities they couldn't control. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was catastrophic across the northern plains. It began in November with blizzards and bitter cold. The snow kept coming, deeper than anyone could remember. Temperatures plunged and stayed low for weeks. Cattle, already weakened by overgrazing during the preceding summer and fall, couldn't paw through the deep snow to reach grass. They drifted before the storms, piling up against fences, into coulees, anywhere that offered slight shelter, and they died by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. When spring finally came and ranchers could assess the damage, they found catastrophic losses. Some outfits lost 70, 80, even 90% of their herds. Carcasses were everywhere, piled in drawers, scattered across the plains, rotting along stream banks. The stench was terrible. Cowboys who had ridden out to check on cattle that winter told stories of finding animals standing frozen, having died on their feet. The disaster destroyed many ranchers financially. Eastern and foreign investors who had been sold on Wyoming ranching as a safe, high-return investment discovered they had lost their capital. Many pulled out. Others demanded changes in how ranches were managed. The era of completely open-range ranching was over. Ranchers began to adapt. They purchased or leased land to ensure access to water and hay meadows. They grew hay to provide winter feed. They built more substantial ranch buildings and corrals. They reduced herd sizes to match the carrying capacity of the land. Ranching didn't disappear, but it became more conservative, more realistic, and less spectacularly profitable. The big cattlemen, watching their empires contract, looked for scapegoats. They blamed rustlers. They blamed small ranchers. They blamed homesteaders. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which represented the large cattle interests, became increasingly aggressive in asserting control. They maintained a blacklist of cowboys who were suspected of rustling or just of being insufficiently loyal to the big outfits. Cowboys on the blacklist couldn't find work at any ranch that belonged to the association. Tensions reached a breaking point in Johnson County, in north-central Wyoming. The county had become a center of conflict between big cattlemen and small ranchers and homesteaders. In spring 1892, the big cattlemen decided to take matters into their own hands. They organized an invasion force, hiring gunmen from Texas and rounding up a posse of stock detectives, ranch foremen, and a few members of the Wyoming elite. This force, about 50 men, took a train north from Cheyenne, accompanied by a surgeon, a newspaper reporter, and supply wagons. Their plan was to invade Johnson County, systematically kill suspected rustlers and small ranchers who had been accused of cattle theft, and establish control through terror. They had a list of 70 names. The invasion began at the KC Ranch on April 9, 1892. The invaders surrounded the cabin where Nick Ray and Nate Champion, two cowboys who were on the death list, were staying. They killed Ray in an initial exchange of fire, then besieged the cabin. Champion held out alone for hours, even writing a journal of the siege, scribbling entries between bursts of gunfire. Finally, the invaders set the cabin on fire. Champion tried to escape through the smoke, but was shot down and killed. By this time, word of the invasion had spread. Local residents rallied. Armed men from Buffalo, the county seat, rode out to confront the invaders. The invaders, realizing they were now outnumbered and facing people who knew the country and were fighting to defend their homes, retreated to the TA Ranch and fortified it, digging trenches and preparing for a siege. The local forces surrounded the ranch. Shooting went on for days. The situation was stalemated. Then the invaders called in a favor from powerful friends. Messages were sent to Wyoming's governor and to Washington. The governor asked for federal troops to intervene. President Benjamin Harrison ordered the army to rescue the invaders. Cavalry from Fort McKinney arrived and took the invaders into custody, ostensibly arresting them but actually protecting them from the angry locals. The invaders were taken to Cheyenne. They were charged with murder, but the case never went to trial. Witnesses were intimidated. The county couldn't afford the costs of a trial in distant Cheyenne. Charges were eventually dropped. Not one of the invaders served time for the murders they had committed. The Johnson County War, as it became known, was a scandal, but it was also a turning point. The naked use of violence by the big cattlemen and their ability to escape justice damaged their public image and political power. Small ranchers and homesteaders continued to settle in Wyoming. The open range continued to shrink as more land was fenced. The era of the cattle barons was definitively over. Yet cattle ranching remained, and remains to this day, central to Wyoming's economy and identity. The image of the cowboy, riding the range, independent and tough, became a powerful symbol of Wyoming and the West. That image was partly myth. The reality of a cowboy's life was hard, poorly paid, and often monotonous, but myths have power. Wyoming embraced the cowboy mythos, and it became part of how the state understood itself. While ranchers were battling over grass and water, other people were digging into Wyoming's mountains, looking for different kinds of wealth. Mining had been part of Wyoming's economy since the 1850s, when gold prospectors passed through on their way to California. Small gold strikes in Wyoming attracted brief rushes, the most notable being at South Pass City in 1867. but none of the gold discoveries were large enough to sustain major operations. What Wyoming had in abundance wasn't gold but coal. The coal deposits were discovered early, and the railroad made them valuable. Steam locomotives needed fuel, and coal was ideal. The Union Pacific, needing coal for its operations, quickly developed mines near Rock Springs, Hanna, and other locations along its route. Coal mining attracted workers from around the world. In the 1870s and 1880s, miners included Americans, but also large numbers of immigrants: Welsh, English, Irish, Scots, Finns, Swedes, Slavs, and Chinese. This diversity sometimes created tension, particularly in Rock Springs, which became the site of one of the ugliest incidents in Wyoming's history. By 1885, Rock Springs had a population of about 2,000, roughly half of whom were Chinese. The Chinese miners generally worked for lower wages than white miners, and they were often willing to work during strikes, making them unpopular with labor organizers. Anti-Chinese sentiment, already strong throughout the West, was virulent in Rock Springs. On September 2, 1885, a dispute between white and Chinese miners at one of the mines escalated into mob violence. A group of white miners and other residents attacked Rock Springs Chinatown. They fired into homes, set buildings ablaze, and hunted down fleeing Chinese. By the time federal troops arrived to restore order, at least 28 Chinese miners had been killed, though the actual number may have been higher. Hundreds more were driven from town, losing everything they owned. No one was ever prosecuted for the massacre. The Chinese government protested, and the US government eventually paid compensation to the victims, but the perpetrators faced no consequences. Most of the Chinese miners eventually returned to Rock Springs, having few other options, but the massacre left a deep scar. Coal mining remained dangerous work even without racial violence. Cave-ins, explosions, gas leaks, and equipment accidents killed miners regularly. In 1903, an explosion at the Hanna mine killed 169 men, one of the deadliest mining disasters in American history. In 1908, another explosion at the same mine killed 59 more. These disasters left widows and orphans. Entire communities plunged into grief. Miners organized unions to fight for better pay, safer conditions, and decent treatment. The United Mine Workers established locals in Wyoming's coal towns. Strikes were common, sometimes turning violent when companies brought in strikebreakers or state militia was called in to protect company property. The struggle between labor and capital in Wyoming's mines mirrored conflicts happening across industrial America. Oil was discovered in Wyoming in the 1880s, first in small quantities near Lander, then in larger deposits in various locations. The first commercial oil well in Wyoming was drilled near Dallas Dome in Fremont County in 1884. Other fields were soon discovered at Salt Creek, north of Casper, and in the Powder River Basin. Oil development was initially slow because of Wyoming's isolation and the difficulty of transporting oil to markets. But as automobile use increased in the early 20th century, demand for gasoline skyrocketed. Wyoming's oil fields became more valuable. Towns like Casper boomed. The Salt Creek field, in particular, became one of the most productive oil fields in the nation during the 1920s. The oil industry brought prosperity, but also boom and bust cycles that would become a recurring pattern in Wyoming's economy. When oil prices were high, towns grew rapidly, wages were good, and optimism reigned. When prices fell, wells shut down, workers left, businesses closed, and towns contracted. This volatility made planning difficult and left Wyoming's economy vulnerable to forces beyond anyone's control. Mining wasn't limited to coal and oil. Wyoming had deposits of various minerals: copper, iron, uranium, trona, bentonite. Each of these would have its moment. Uranium mining boomed during the Cold War, when the federal government purchased uranium for nuclear weapons. Trona, a sodium carbonate mineral used in glass and chemical manufacturing, was discovered in large deposits near Green River and became a major export. These industries diversified Wyoming's economy but didn't fundamentally change its character. Wyoming remained a place where people extracted resources from the earth and shipped them elsewhere for processing and use. While Wyoming was developing economically, it was also defining itself politically and socially. The creation of Wyoming Territory in 1868 brought formal government structure, though it was a structure imposed from outside. The president appointed the territorial governor and other major officials. Wyoming residents elected a legislature, but its acts could be overruled by Congress. One of the most remarkable facts about Wyoming is that it was the first place in the United States, and one of the first places in the world, where women gained full voting rights. In December 1869, just months after the territory was organized, the territorial legislature passed a bill granting women the right to vote and hold office. Governor John Campbell signed it into law on December 10, 1869. Why did Wyoming do this? The motives were mixed. Some legislators genuinely believed in women's equality. Others thought granting women the vote would attract more female settlers to the territory, which had a severe gender imbalance. Still others apparently supported the measure as a publicity stunt, assuming it would attract attention, and some may have expected Governor Campbell to veto it. He didn't. The law made Wyoming famous, at least in reform circles. The territory was celebrated by suffragists as a beacon of progress. Women in Wyoming could vote, serve on juries, and hold office at a time when women in most of the world had none of these rights. Esther Hobart Morris became the first female justice of the peace in the nation, serving in South Pass City. When Wyoming applied for statehood in 1890, there was pressure from some in Congress to make Wyoming remove women's suffrage as a condition of admission. The Wyoming territorial legislature refused, reportedly stating they would remain a territory for 100 years rather than join the Union without women's suffrage. Congress backed down, and Wyoming entered the Union on July 10, 1890, as the 44th state, retaining women's suffrage. The state adopted the nickname the Equality State and featured a woman on horseback on its official seal. Was Wyoming truly more progressive than other places? That's complicated. Women's suffrage in Wyoming coexisted with virulent racism toward Chinese and Native peoples. The state was politically conservative in many ways, but the suffrage law was real. Women really could vote and hold office, and Wyoming's example helped inspire the broader women's suffrage movement that would eventually win voting rights for women nationally, with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Statehood brought a measure of political maturity, but Wyoming remained sparsely populated, economically dependent on extractive industries, and shaped by its landscape in ways that both limited and defined it. The population in 1890 was only about 60,000, spread across nearly 100,000 square miles. Most people lived in small towns along the railroad or in isolated ranches and mining camps. Vast areas had virtually no permanent residents. This emptiness, this sense of space and isolation, shaped Wyoming's character. People were spread thin, communities were small, and you often had to rely on yourself because help might be hours or days away. This bred a kind of independence, a reluctance to accept outside interference, a belief that you should be able to do what you wanted on your own land without government telling you otherwise. At the same time, Wyoming's economy depended on federal policy and national markets in ways that complicated this independence. Ranchers grazed cattle on federal land. Mining operated under federal regulations. The railroad, essential to the economy, was regulated by federal authorities. So Wyoming's relationship with the federal government was always complex, resentful of federal control but dependent on federal resources and access to federal land. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Wyoming's basic patterns were established. This would be a place of extraction and agriculture, ranching and mining, small towns and vast spaces. The native peoples who had lived here for thousands of years were confined to reservations, their traditional ways of life destroyed or severely constrained. The buffalo were nearly extinct, victims of commercial hunting and deliberate policy. The open range was being fenced and settled. The frontier, in the formal sense that the Census Bureau had defined it, was closed. Yet Wyoming retained and retains something of a frontier character. The population would never grow very large, remaining under 600,000 even into the 21st century, making Wyoming the least populous state in the nation. The landscape continued to dominate. You could still stand in many places and see nothing human-made in any direction, just grass and sagebrush rolling to distant mountains, the sky enormous overhead, the wind constant. Let's turn now to one of Wyoming's most significant contributions to American culture and to the world, Yellowstone National Park. The story of Yellowstone is a story of exploration, wonder, political maneuvering, and a radical idea that would transform how humans think about wilderness and conservation. The region that would become Yellowstone had been known to native peoples for thousands of years. The various tribes used the area, though it was probably never heavily populated due to its high elevation, volcanic activity, and harsh winters. The Shoshone, Bannock, Crow, and Blackfeet all had connections to the region. They knew about the geysers, hot springs, and mud pots. These features appeared in their stories and traditions, places of power and mystery. Euro-American trappers heard stories about this strange country from native guides and occasionally ventured into the area. John Coulter, as we discussed earlier, probably saw parts of Yellowstone in 1807, though exactly where he went remains uncertain. Other mountain men passed through. Jim Bridger told stories about the region, though as usual with Bridger, it was hard to know what was truth and what was embellishment. The first organized Euro-American exploration came in 1869, when a party led by David Folsom explored the region, visiting geysers and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. They returned with detailed accounts and measurements, though many people still doubted their reports. The following year, 1870, a more official expedition was organized. This was the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, led by Montana Surveyor General Henry Washburn and accompanied by a U.S. Army escort under Lieutenant Gustavus Doane. This expedition spent nearly a month in the Yellowstone region, documenting its features and marveling at its wonders. They named many of the thermal features, including Old Faithful, the geyser that erupts with remarkable regularity. According to tradition, members of the expedition sat around a campfire one evening and discussed what should be done with this amazing place. One member, Cornelius Hedges, supposedly proposed that rather than claiming it for private development, it should be set aside as a national park, protected for the enjoyment of all people. This story is probably romanticized. The reality was likely more complex and self-interested, but the idea took root. The expedition members, particularly Nathaniel Langford, began a campaign to publicize Yellowstone and advocate for its protection. Articles appeared in national magazines, lectures were given, public interest grew. In 1871, another expedition was organized, this one explicitly scientific and government-sponsored. Ferdinand Hayden, head of the U.S. Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories, led a large party that included photographer William Henry Jackson and artist Thomas Moran. Their mission was to document Yellowstone's features scientifically and to bring back visual evidence of its wonders. Jackson's photographs and Moran's paintings did something that written descriptions alone couldn't. They made Yellowstone real for people who hadn't seen it. Moran's grand canvases, particularly his massive painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, captured the drama and beauty of the landscape. Jackson's photographs provided documentary evidence that this place was real, not exaggerated or imagined. The Hayden Expedition's report, along with the images and specimens collected, provided Congress with compelling evidence that Yellowstone was unique and deserved protection. The timing was fortuitous. The idea of national parks was not entirely new. Yosemite Valley had been granted to California as a state park in 1864, but the concept of a large federally protected national park was novel. Railroad interests saw an opportunity. If Yellowstone became a park, tourists would come, and tourists needed transportation. The Northern Pacific Railroad lobbied for the park's creation, understanding that it would generate business. Conservation-minded politicians, including some who saw protecting natural wonders as a matter of national pride, also supported the idea. The legislation moved through Congress with remarkable speed. On March 1, 1872, President Ulysses Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act, establishing Yellowstone as the world's first national park, a vast reserve of over 2 million acres set aside for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. It was a revolutionary concept, the idea that wildland should be preserved in its natural state, not for economic exploitation, but for its intrinsic value and for public access. Of course, the reality was more complicated than the ideal. What did it mean to preserve land in its natural state when native peoples had been using and shaping that land for millennia? The creation of Yellowstone National Park was also an act of dispossession. Native peoples were banned from living in or hunting in the park, losing access to a region they had used for generations. The park was natural only in the sense that it was being reserved from Euro-American development. It was being made natural by removing the indigenous peoples who had been part of its ecology. The early years of Yellowstone as a park were chaotic. Congress created the park, but provided almost no funding for its administration or protection. There was no park service that wouldn't be established until 1916. A civilian superintendent was appointed. Nathaniel Langford got the job, but he had no staff, no budget, and no enforcement power. Poachers killed wildlife, vandals damaged thermal features, squatters built cabins and claimed land. The park was a park in name only. By the 1880s, the situation had deteriorated to the point that the Army was called in. From 1886 to 1918, the U.S. Army administered Yellowstone with a detachment of cavalry stationed at Fort Yellowstone, now known as Mammoth Hot Springs. The soldiers patrolled the park, arrested poachers, fought fires, and built roads and infrastructure. They did a reasonably good job, given their resources, and they established traditions of park protection that would influence how national parks were managed going forward. Tourism grew slowly at first. Reaching Yellowstone required a long journey by train and then by stagecoach over rough roads. Accommodations were primitive, but gradually hotels were built, roads improved, and the park became more accessible. By the early 20th century, thousands of visitors came each summer to see Old Faithful, the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, the hot springs of Mammoth, and the park's abundant wildlife. The establishment of Yellowstone sparked a movement. If this place deserved protection, what about other remarkable landscapes? Over the following decades, more national parks were created: Yosemite, Sequoia, Mount Rainier, Crater Lake, and many others. The National Park Service was established in 1916 to manage these parks professionally. The idea that had seemed radical in 1872, that wilderness should be preserved rather than exploited, became increasingly accepted, at least in principle. Wyoming would eventually be home to two national parks. In Grand Teton National Park, protecting the spectacular Teton Range just south of Yellowstone, was established in 1929 after years of controversy. Ranchers and local residents opposed the park, fearing it would restrict their access to land and resources. John D. Rockefeller Jr. quietly purchased much of the land that would become the park, then donated it to the federal government, a maneuver that enraged locals but ultimately preserved one of the most stunning mountain landscapes in North America. Yellowstone's importance extended beyond tourism and conservation. It was a living laboratory for studying ecology, geology, and wildlife management. Scientists came to study its thermal features, trying to understand the volcanic processes that created them. Biologists studied its wildlife populations, learning about predator-prey relationships, population dynamics, and ecosystem processes. The park became a place where Americans could encounter wildness, could see animals that had been exterminated elsewhere, wolves, though these would be killed off in the park by the 1920s and not restored until the 1990s, grizzly bears, bison, elk, and countless other species. The bison in Yellowstone deserves special mention. Remember that by 1890, fewer than 1,000 bison remained in North America, down from tens of millions. A small herd had survived in Yellowstone, protected by the park's remote location, and eventually by Army patrols. This herd, supplemented by animals from other small surviving populations, became the foundation for bison restoration efforts. Today, thousands of bison live in Yellowstone and in other locations where they've been reintroduced. The species was pulled back from the brink of extinction, and Yellowstone played a crucial role in that recovery. Yet the park's history also includes missteps and lessons learned. Early park managers, influenced by prevailing ideas about wildlife management, tried to create ideal conditions for desirable species. This meant killing predators, wolves, cougars, coyotes, because they preyed on elk and deer. It meant feeding bears and allowing them to become habituated to humans, creating dangerous situations and ultimately harming the bears. It meant suppressing all fires, not understanding that fire is a natural part of many ecosystems, and that preventing fire could lead to catastrophic burns when fuel accumulated. Over time, management philosophy shifted toward a more ecological approach, recognizing that natural processes, including predation and fire, are essential parts of healthy ecosystems. This shift was gradual and incomplete, but it represented growing understanding that preserving nature meant preserving natural processes, not creating and maintaining some idealized static condition. As the 20th century progressed, Wyoming continued its pattern of economic boom and bust, tied to commodity prices, weather, and national policy. The 1920s brought prosperity driven by oil development and agricultural expansion. Then came the Great Depression, and Wyoming, like the rest of the nation, suffered. Drought compounded economic hardship, particularly for ranchers and farmers. The 1930s Dust Bowl, though centered farther south on the plains, affected parts of eastern Wyoming. Ranchers watched topsoil blow away, their livestock starve, and their livelihoods disappear. Federal programs of the New Deal brought some relief. The Civilian Conservation Corps built infrastructure in Wyoming, including facilities in the national parks and forests, roads and water projects. The Works Progress Administration employed people in construction and other public works. These programs helped, but they didn't solve the fundamental problems of an economy based on extractive industries and vulnerable to forces beyond local control. World War II brought dramatic change. Military bases were established in Wyoming, bringing federal dollars and employment. The state's resources, particularly oil and coal, were crucial to the war effort. After the war, the Cold War created demand for Wyoming's uranium. The 1950s uranium boom brought prospectors scrambling across Wyoming's deserts and badlands, staking claims and opening mines. Towns appeared overnight, then faded just as quickly when the boom ended. In the 1960s and 1970s, Wyoming experienced another energy boom, this time driven by coal. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 made domestic energy sources more valuable. Wyoming's vast coal reserves, particularly the thick, low-sulfur coal of the Powder River Basin, became attractive. Enormous surface mines opened, stripping away hundreds of feet of overburden to reach coal seams that could be dozens of feet thick. These mines were highly mechanized, using massive draglines and trucks that could carry hundreds of tons of coal at once. The Powder River Basin became one of the most productive coal mining regions in the world. Unit trains composed entirely of coal cars, stretched for miles, carrying coal to power plants across the country. Wyoming's coal production soared, making the state one of the leading coal producers in the nation. Tax revenues from coal and other minerals funded state government, built schools, and paid for infrastructure. But as always, prosperity brought challenges. The coal industry employed relatively few people given its economic scale. The mines were highly automated. The jobs that existed were well paid, but often physically demanding and sometimes dangerous. The environmental impacts of surface mining were significant. Landscapes transformed, water tables disrupted, air quality affected. Federal law required mines to reclaim land after mining, restoring it to productive use, but whether reclamation could truly restore what had been lost remained debatable. Oil and gas development also intensified. New technologies, including hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, allowed companies to extract oil and gas from formations that had previously been uneconomic. The Jonah Field and Pindale anticline in southwestern Wyoming became major gas-producing areas. Tens of thousands of wells were drilled. Roads, pipelines, and processing facilities covered landscapes that had been largely empty. These developments brought jobs and revenue, but also controversy. Environmentalists worried about impacts on wildlife, particularly on crucial migration routes and winter habitat for pronghorn and mule deer. Air quality degraded in some areas, with winter inversions trapping emissions and creating pollution levels that rivaled urban areas. Communities struggled to accommodate sudden population growth, schools overwhelmed, housing scarce, infrastructure strained. Wyoming's small population and vast land area created unique political dynamics. The state consistently ranked among the most conservative in the nation politically. Federal land ownership. The federal government owns roughly 48% of Wyoming's land, was a constant source of tension. Many Wyoming residents resented federal control, believing they should have more say over how land in their state was used. At the same time, those federal lands provided crucial economic benefits. Ranchers grazed livestock on federal land at relatively low cost. Energy companies extracted minerals from federal land, paying royalties to federal and state governments. Tourists visited federal lands supporting local businesses. So the relationship with federal ownership was complex, a mix of resentment and dependence. Water was always a central issue in Wyoming, as it is throughout the arid West. Wyoming is an upstream state, the headwaters of multiple major river systems, the Green, Snake, Yellowstone, Bighorn, North Platte, and others, originate in Wyoming's mountains. Water flowing from Wyoming supplies farms, cities, and industries in multiple downstream states. Interstate compacts and court decisions allocated water among states, but conflicts persisted. Within Wyoming, water rights were allocated based on the prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right. Those who established water rights earliest had priority during times of shortage. This system protected established uses, primarily agricultural, but made it difficult to adapt to changing circumstances or to protect water for environmental purposes. As climate patterns shifted in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, water became even more contentious. Snowpack in the mountains, the source of most of Wyoming's water, showed signs of decreasing. Droughts became more frequent and severe. Wildfires increased in frequency and intensity. These changes weren't necessarily new. Wyoming's climate has always been variable, but the trends raise questions about long-term sustainability. Wyoming's native peoples, meanwhile, continued their presence on the Wind River Reservation, though their struggles received little attention from most Wyoming residents. Poverty rates on the reservation were high, unemployment was chronic, health outcomes were poor. The tribes, the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, worked to maintain their cultures, languages, and sovereignty while navigating the complexities of federal Indian law and policy. In recent decades, there has been growing recognition of past injustices and growing efforts, however imperfect, toward reconciliation and respect for tribal sovereignty. Sacred sites like Medicine Wheel have received greater protection. Tribal management of wildlife and resources on reservation lands has expanded. Educational efforts have worked to teach Wyoming's fuller history, including the perspectives of native peoples. These are small steps, and enormous challenges remain, but they represent movement in a positive direction. Wyoming's small population, which had always been a limiting factor economically and politically, began to be seen by some as an asset. While most of America became increasingly urbanized, Wyoming remained rural. More than half the state's population lived in towns of fewer than 10,000 people. The state had no major metropolitan area. This meant Wyoming retained a different pace of life, a different sense of community, and a different relationship with the land. For those who valued space, quiet, and access to wildness, Wyoming was ideal. You could still find solitude, could still see landscapes largely unmarred by human development, could still experience the night sky without light pollution. Wildlife remained abundant in many areas. Hunting, fishing, hiking, and other outdoor recreation were central to many residents' lives. tourism became increasingly important to the economy. Yellowstone and Grand Teton attracted millions of visitors annually. These visitors needed places to stay, food to eat, and activities to fill their days, supporting businesses in gateway communities like Jackson, Cody, and others. Ski resorts, guest ranches, outfitters, and guides all catered to visitors seeking outdoor experiences. Jackson Hole, the valley south of Yellowstone, and at the base of the Tetons, underwent a particularly dramatic transformation. Once an isolated ranching valley, it became one of the most desirable resort communities in North America. Jackson attracted wealthy part-time residents, celebrities, and retirees drawn by stunning scenery and outdoor recreation opportunities. Real estate prices soared. The town developed an odd split personality, part Western working community and part upscale resort. This gentrification of parts of Wyoming created tensions. Longtime residents found themselves unable to afford housing in communities where they'd lived for generations. Workers essential to the tourism industry, hotel staff, restaurant workers, ski lift operators, struggled to find affordable places to live. The character of some communities changed, becoming less authentic and more oriented toward visitors and wealthy newcomers. Yet Wyoming resisted some of the homogenization affecting much of America. The state remained distinctively itself, independent, conservative, proud, and deeply connected to its landscape and history. Cowboys remained a real presence, not just a tourist attraction. Ranching, though economically less dominant than in the past, remained central to the state's identity. The cowboy hat was everyday wear, not a costume. Let's consider Wyoming's political culture more deeply. The state's conservatism was rooted in multiple factors: a rural population that valued self-reliance, an economy based on resource extraction industries that often clashed with environmental regulations, and a cultural tradition that emphasized individual freedom and limited government. Wyoming residents often expressed deep skepticism of outside interference, whether from the federal government, environmental groups, or coastal elites who seemed to not understand Wyoming's way of life. This conservatism coexisted with Wyoming's early embrace of women's suffrage and some progressive policies. The state has often been willing to experiment and to chart its own course. It was the first state to elect a female governor, Nellie Taylor Ross, in 1924, though she served only a partial term. Wyoming's legislature has been willing to consider unconventional policies when they seemed pragmatic or advantageous. Education in Wyoming faced ongoing challenges. With a small, dispersed population, maintaining schools was difficult and expensive. Rural schools sometimes had only a handful of students. The University of Wyoming, established in 1886 in Laramie, was the state's only four-year public university. The university played an important role not just in education, but in research, particularly in areas relevant to Wyoming's economy, petroleum engineering, agriculture, wildlife management, geology. The state invested heavily in K-12 education, funded largely by energy revenues. When energy prices were high and tax revenues abundant, schools could afford good facilities, competitive teacher salaries, and robust programs. When energy prices fell, budgets tightened, and difficult decisions had to be made. This boom-bust cycle in education funding was damaging, making it hard to plan and creating instability. Healthcare was another challenge. Wyoming's rural nature meant many areas lacked adequate medical facilities. Recruiting and retaining doctors and other healthcare professionals in small, isolated towns was difficult. Hospitals in rural areas struggled financially. Some communities lost their hospitals, leaving residents facing long drives for medical care. For emergencies, this could be life-threatening. Infrastructure also presented challenges. Maintaining roads across such a large, sparsely populated state was expensive. Wyoming's climate was hard on roads. Winter freeze-thaw cycles, harsh storms, and temperature extremes all took their toll. The state invested heavily in road maintenance, understanding that good roads were essential for commerce and safety. Wyoming's political representation in national politics gave it outsized influence relative to its population. Like every state, Wyoming has 2 U.S. senators regardless of population. With fewer than 600,000 people, Wyoming had the same Senate representation as California with nearly 40 million. This meant Wyoming residents had more per capita influence in the Senate than residents of any other state. Wyoming politicians often became influential in Congress, particularly on issues related to public lands, energy, and natural resources. Dick Cheney, who grew up in Casper, served as Wyoming's lone member of the House of Representatives before becoming Secretary of Defense and later Vice President. He embodied a particular Wyoming political type: conservative, pro-business, skeptical of environmental regulation, and strongly supportive of resource extraction industries. Whether you agreed with his politics or not, he was undeniably influential, and his career demonstrated that Wyoming politicians could wield power far beyond what the state's population might suggest. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Wyoming faced questions about its future. The energy industry that had sustained the state's economy for decades faced growing challenges. Coal, which had been so profitable, was increasingly displaced by natural gas and renewable energy sources. Concerns about climate change led to growing pressure to reduce fossil fuel use. Coal-fired power plants were being retired. Demand for Wyoming coal declined. The state worked to adapt. There was investment in renewable energy, particularly wind power. Wyoming's wind resources, long viewed as just a nuisance, were now seen as assets. Wind farms sprouted across parts of the state, their turbines spinning in the constant breeze. But wind energy was controversial too. It required transmission lines to carry power to distant markets, and those lines were expensive and faced opposition from landowners. Wind energy jobs didn't replace coal mining jobs one for one, and the communities that had depended on coal faced uncertain futures. Tourism offered some diversification, but it brought its own challenges. Popular destinations faced overcrowding. Yellowstone, in particular, struggled with too many visitors, traffic jams on park roads, damage to sensitive areas, and wildlife stressed by human presence. Finding the balance between access and preservation was difficult. There were efforts to promote technology and other industries to diversify Wyoming's economy beyond extraction and tourism. The state had some advantages: no state income tax, relatively low cost of living in some areas, and that famous quality of life. But it also had disadvantages: isolation, small population, limited workforce, harsh climate. Attracting businesses and workers was an ongoing challenge. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 affected Wyoming as it did everywhere, though perhaps differently than more densely populated areas. Wyoming's small population and low density initially seemed like advantages, making social distancing easier, but rural hospitals were stressed. The decline in tourism during lockdowns hit gateway communities hard, and Wyoming, with its libertarian streak and skepticism of government mandates, saw significant resistance to public health measures. Throughout all these changes and challenges, certain constants remained. The landscape still dominated. The mountains still rose dramatically. The plains still stretched endlessly. The sky was still enormous. Wildlife still roamed in abundance compared to most of America. These were the things that made Wyoming. Wyoming, the things that had drawn people for thousands of years and continued to draw them. Think about what the landscape means to those who live here. It's not just scenery, though it's certainly that. It's not just economic resources, though it's that too. The landscape is identity. It shapes how people think about themselves. The isolation breeds self-reliance. The harshness breeds toughness. The beauty breeds appreciation for wildness and a distrust of those who want to develop or change things. There's a saying in Wyoming, often attributed to various sources: "I'm from Wyoming. We don't do much dancing. We're just trying to stand up." It captures something essential about the place: a certain stoicism, a dry sense of humor, an acknowledgement that life here requires endurance. The wind blows, the winters are brutal, the economy cycles between boom and bust, but people endure. Ranching families, some of whom have worked the same land for 4 or 5 generations, embody this endurance. They've survived droughts and blizzards, low cattle prices and high feed costs, government regulations and changing markets. They've adapted, diversified, found ways to continue. Many now supplement ranching income with other work, welcoming hunters, running guest operations, or working jobs in town. But they remain on the land, committed to a way of life that is economically marginal but culturally central. The independent streak in Wyoming runs deep. There's resistance to being told what to do, whether by government, by corporations, or by outsiders. This can manifest as resistance to environmental regulations that limit how ranchers and energy companies use land. It can manifest as resistance to development that would change communities' character. It's a complicated independence, sometimes contradictory, but it's deeply felt. Community matters in Wyoming in ways that might surprise outsiders. In small towns, people know each other, help each other, and depend on each other. When a rancher is injured, neighbors will come help with chores. When a family faces tragedy, the community rallies. There's less anonymity than in cities, which can be both good and challenging. You can't easily escape your reputation or your past, but you also have networks of support that urban dwellers might envy. High school sports are community events. Friday night football games in small towns draw crowds that represent a significant percentage of the population. Basketball tournaments fill gymnasiums. These aren't just sporting events, they're social gatherings, opportunities to see neighbors, to feel part of something larger than yourself. In communities that might not have much else, school activities provide focus and pride. The arts have a place in Wyoming too, though perhaps not as visible as in more urban states. The state has produced notable writers, artists and musicians who have drawn on Wyoming's landscape and culture for inspiration. The cowboy poetry movement, celebrating the oral traditions of working cowboys and ranchers, found enthusiastic support. Music ranges from traditional cowboy songs to contemporary country, rock, and other genres. Visual artists have long been drawn to Wyoming's dramatic scenery, following in the tradition of Thomas Moran and other 19th century painters. Museums throughout the state work to preserve and interpret Wyoming's history. The Buffalo Bill Center of the West in Cody houses multiple museums covering Western art, Plains Indians, firearms, natural history, and Buffalo Bill himself. The National Museum of Wildlife Art near Jackson showcases art depicting wildlife from around the world. Smaller museums in towns throughout the state preserve local history, often run by dedicated volunteers who understand that preserving the past matters for understanding who we are. Historic sites mark important events and places. Fort Laramie has been preserved as a National Historic Site, its buildings restored to evoke the fort's appearance during its 19th century heyday. Independence Rock still bears the names of emigrants who passed this way more than a century and a half ago. The sites of massacres, battles, and other tragic events are marked, serving as reminders of the costs of westward expansion and the conflicts that shaped Wyoming. Native perspectives on Wyoming's history have gradually gained greater recognition, though this process remains incomplete. The Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho on the Wind River Reservation work to educate others about their history, culture, and continuing presence. Cultural centers, language preservation programs, and educational initiatives help ensure that younger generations maintain connections to their heritage. Other tribes that were historically associated with Wyoming, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, and others, maintain connections to the land, even though they now live on reservations outside Wyoming's borders. Sacred sites in Wyoming remain important to these peoples. There have been conflicts over access to and protection of these sites, but also growing recognition that these places hold spiritual significance that deserves respect. The question of what Wyoming becomes in the 21st century remains open. Will it find ways to diversify its economy beyond extraction and tourism? Will it adapt to climate change and shifting energy markets? Will it maintain its distinctive character as development pressure increases in some areas? Will it find ways to honor its complex history, including the perspectives of those who were displaced and marginalized? There are no easy answers. Wyoming faces challenges, that are both unique to its circumstances and shared with rural areas throughout the American West. The state's small population gives it outsized political influence, but limits economic opportunities. Its magnificent landscapes are both its greatest asset and vulnerable to damage from overuse or development. Its cultural traditions are sources of strength, but can also make adaptation difficult. What seems certain is that Wyoming will remain a place defined by its landscape and shaped by the people who have called it home across thousands of years. From the Paleo-Indians who hunted mammoths, to the trappers who mapped its mountains, to the immigrants who crossed its plains, to the ranchers and miners who built its economy, to the visitors who come to marvel at its parks. Wyoming has always been a place of passage and transformation. The Wind River still flows from the mountains, cutting its canyon through ancient rocks. The Tetons still rise dramatically above Jackson Hole, their granite faces catching the first light of morning. Yellowstone's geysers still erupt with predictable unpredictability, reminding us that this is geologically active land, alive beneath our feet. The plains still roll endlessly, covered in grass and sagebrush, home to pronghorn and prairie dogs, and all the creatures that have adapted to this austere environment. Stand somewhere in Wyoming, on a clear night, far from any town, and look up. The stars are astonishing, spread across the sky in such profusion that it's overwhelming. The Milky Way is clearly visible, a river of light across the darkness. You can see satellites moving, steady points of light tracking across the heavens. Sometimes meteors streak across your vision. The vastness above mirrors the vastness around you, and you feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something enormous. This is what Wyoming offers, a chance to feel small in the best way, to be reminded that humans are one small part of a much larger story. The rocks beneath your feet are hundreds of millions of years old. The mountains were pushed up by forces that dwarf human power. The rivers have been flowing far longer than humans have existed. We are recent arrivals, and our time here is brief. Yet we leave our marks. We build, we name places, we tell stories, we try to shape the land to our needs and desires. The native peoples who lived here for millennia left marks that we can still read: stone structures, rock art, trails worn into stone. The trappers and emigrants left names and roots. The ranchers left buildings and fences. The miners left holes and tailings. All of us who pass through or who stay leave something behind, evidence of our presence, traces that future people will interpret and try to understand. Wyoming's history is ultimately a human story played out against an inhuman landscape. The mountains don't care about our politics or our economies. The wind doesn't notice our struggles. The seasons turn regardless of our plans. Yet we persist, adapting to the conditions we find, trying to make lives here, finding meaning in the challenge and beauty of this austere place. There's a resilience in Wyoming's people that matches the resilience of the landscape. Both have endured storms, droughts, fires, and floods. Both have been changed by these events, but have persisted. The cottonwoods along the rivers lose their leaves every winter, seemingly dead, then burst into green every spring. Grass turns brown under drought or frost, then greens again when moisture returns. Life here has learned to endure. For those who love Wyoming, and that includes many who live elsewhere but are drawn back repeatedly, the state represents something increasingly rare: authenticity, space, wilderness, a connection to history and to land that is harder to find in more developed places. This isn't to romanticize Wyoming or to ignore its problems: poverty, substance abuse, suicide rates, economic challenges. All of these are real, but it's to recognize that Wyoming offers something valuable: a different way of being, a different pace, a different set of priorities. The future will bring changes. Climate will shift, perhaps dramatically. The energy economy will continue evolving. Wyoming's population may grow, though probably slowly. Technology will connect even remote ranches to the wider world. Yet the fundamental character of the place, shaped by geology, climate, and history, will persist. Wyoming will remain a place of extremes: extreme weather, extreme beauty, extreme isolation, and extreme independence. Consider what it means to be a state with fewer people than many cities. Wyoming's population is smaller than that of Memphis, Tennessee, or Oklahoma City. The entire state has fewer people than many urban neighborhoods. This creates a different political culture, a different sense of community, and different challenges and opportunities. When everyone knows everyone, or at least knows someone who knows everyone, accountability works differently. You can't be anonymous. Your reputation matters. This can be constraining, but it also creates social cohesion. People look out for each other because they know each other. Help is personal, not institutional. The role of women in Wyoming's history is worth reflecting on further. Wyoming was first in women's suffrage, first to have a female governor, first to have a female justice of the peace. Yet the state has also been traditionally male-dominated in its industries and culture. Ranching, mining, and oil work have been primarily male occupations. The cowboy mythos is inherently masculine. Women in Wyoming have often had to be tough, resourceful, and independent. Ranch women worked alongside men, doing hard physical labor. They raised families in isolated conditions, often without easy access to medical care, schools, or other services. They maintained households, managed accounts, and kept operations running. These women were equal partners in building Wyoming's economy and communities, even if their contributions were often invisible or undervalued. In modern Wyoming, women continue to face challenges, but also opportunities. The state's small size means that individual women can have significant impact. Women serve in the legislature, lead businesses, run organizations, and shape their communities. Yet inequalities persist in pay, opportunities, and representation in certain fields. The native women of Wyoming's tribes faced and face particular challenges: loss of traditional roles and status as cultures were disrupted, economic marginalization on reservations, and vulnerability to violence that receives insufficient attention and response. Their strength and resilience in maintaining families, cultures, and communities, despite these challenges, deserves recognition and respect. Education has been a path forward for many Wyoming women, though access hasn't always been equal. The University of Wyoming has educated generations of women who have gone on to careers throughout the state and nation. Smaller community colleges provide accessible education in regions far from Laramie, yet brain drain remains a problem. Young people, especially those with education and ambition, often leave Wyoming for opportunities elsewhere. This tension between staying and leaving is fundamental to Wyoming's experience. Young people grow up here, often in small towns, graduate from high school, and face a choice: stay in Wyoming, where opportunities may be limited, but where family, landscape, and culture are familiar, or leave for college, jobs, and experiences elsewhere, perhaps never to return. There's no right answer, but the choice shapes individual lives and the state's future. Those who stay often do so for quality of life reasons. They value access to outdoor recreation, tight communities, lower costs of living than in many places, and the intangible sense of belonging to a place. They accept trade-offs, fewer job options, greater distance from cultural amenities available in cities, harder access to specialized services, and economic instability. They stay because Wyoming is home in a deep sense, not just a place where they happen to live. Those who leave often speak of Wyoming with nostalgia and longing. They miss the mountains, the space, the stars, the sense of community. Many hope to return someday, perhaps in retirement. Some do return, bringing skills and perspectives gained elsewhere and contributing to their home communities in new ways. Others never make it back, except for visits, but carry Wyoming with them, shaped by their experience of growing up in this particular place. Immigration to Wyoming, in the sense of international immigration, has been relatively limited compared to many states. There are communities of immigrants, particularly Latino workers in the agricultural and service industries, refugees resettled through various programs, and workers from other countries employed in specific industries. These newer arrivals add diversity to a state that has been predominantly white, enriching cultural life and bringing new perspectives. However, immigration is also a source of tension. Some long-time residents worry about cultural change, economic competition, and resources. Language barriers can create misunderstandings. Immigrants sometimes face discrimination and marginalization, yet in many communities, immigrant families become integral parts of the social fabric. Their children attend local schools, they participate in community activities, and they contribute economically and culturally. The religious landscape of Wyoming has been predominantly Christian, with various Protestant denominations and a significant Catholic population, particularly in communities with strong Hispanic presence. The Latter-day Saints have a notable presence, especially in western Wyoming, near the Utah border, and in some other communities. There are smaller populations of practitioners of other faiths and growing numbers of people who identify as non-religious. Religious communities have played important roles in Wyoming's history and continue to do so. Churches have been community centers, providing not just spiritual support but social services, education, and gathering spaces. Faith has helped people endure hardships, make sense of loss, and find meaning in difficult circumstances. At the same time, religious conflicts have sometimes divided communities, and tension between religious values and secular governance continues to surface on various issues. Wyoming's relationship with the federal government, already mentioned, deserves deeper consideration. The federal presence is enormous. In addition to owning roughly half the land, the federal government operates numerous agencies with significant presence: the National Park Service, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, military installations, and many others. Federal employees and contractors make up a significant portion of the workforce in some communities. Federal dollars flow into Wyoming through multiple channels: payments to counties with federal land, royalties from mineral extraction on federal land, funding for highways and infrastructure, agricultural subsidies, military spending, and many other programs. Wyoming benefits enormously from federal spending while simultaneously complaining about federal control. This apparent contradiction isn't really a contradiction at all. It's a rational response to a complex relationship. Wyoming residents, particularly those in rural areas, often interact directly with federal land managers and regulations in ways that feel intrusive or arbitrary. A rancher who has grazed cattle on the same federal allotment for generations might face new restrictions because of endangered species concerns or changing management priorities. An energy company that wants to drill wells might face lengthy permitting processes and environmental reviews. From the perspective of those directly affected, federal management can seem distant, unresponsive, and ignorant of local conditions. From the federal perspective, these lands belong to all Americans, not just to Wyoming residents. Management decisions must balance multiple uses and consider long-term sustainability, not just immediate economic benefit. Species preservation, water quality, wilderness protection, and other values matter too. The tension between these perspectives is real and unlikely to be fully resolved. There have been movements advocating for transfer of federal lands to state control or even privatization. Proponents argue that state management would be more responsive to local needs and that Wyoming could manage its lands as well or better than the federal government. Opponents worry that states lack the resources to properly manage such vast areas, that privatization would mean loss of public access, and that short-term economic pressures might lead to environmental degradation. These debates reflect different values and different visions for Wyoming's future. Should the priority be maximizing economic return from natural resources, preserving wilderness and ecosystem health, maintaining traditional uses like ranching and hunting, supporting recreation and tourism? All of these, some balance among them, reasonable people disagree, and the disagreements can be sharp. Energy development, which has been so central to Wyoming's modern economy, faces an uncertain future. Coal is in structural decline, displaced by cheaper natural gas and renewable energy, and facing growing policy pressure to reduce carbon emissions. Oil and gas face growing competition from renewables and shifting policies aimed at addressing climate change. Wyoming's political leadership has generally resisted acknowledging climate change or supporting policies to reduce fossil fuel use, arguing that energy production is essential to the state's economy and that rapid transition would devastate communities. Yet the transitions are happening regardless of policy preferences. Markets are shifting, technologies are evolving. Wyoming will need to adapt, as it has adapted to changes throughout its history. Perhaps that adaptation will include becoming a major producer of renewable energy, exporting wind and solar power to other states. Perhaps it will include carbon capture technology that allows continued use of fossil fuels with reduced emissions. Perhaps it will require fundamental diversification into industries not yet imagined. What seems certain is that change will come. The question is whether Wyoming will shape that change or simply react to it, whether the state can maintain what makes it distinctive while adapting to new realities. The answers will emerge from the choices made by Wyoming's people, choices about how to balance preservation and development, tradition and innovation, independence and cooperation. Standing in Wyoming, in any of its many remarkable places, you feel the weight of all this history. The land remembers, in its own way. The rivers still flow in channels cut over millions of years. The rocks still show the marks of ancient seas, volcanic eruptions, glacial scouring. The fossils embedded in stone tell stories of creatures that lived here long before humans existed. And overlaid on this deep geological time are the thinner layers of human presence. The stone tools of Paleo-Indians, the medicine wheel's careful alignments, the ruts worn by wagon wheels, the abandoned mines and ghost towns, the modern highways and wind farms. All of it is Wyoming. All of it is part of the story. The state contains multitudes, contradictions, beauty and harshness, space and intimacy, independence and interdependence. It resists easy summary or simple characterization. You have to experience it to understand it, and even then, you'll only understand part of it. The rancher in the Powder River Basin lives a different Wyoming than the ski instructor in Jackson. The northern Arapaho elder on the Wind River Reservation knows a different Wyoming than the oil worker in Gillette. Yet all are authentically Wyoming, shaped by this landscape and this history. As we come to the end of this journey through Wyoming's story, perhaps the most important thing to remember is that it's not finished. History isn't something that happened in the past and is now over. It's continuous, still being written, still unfolding. The people living in Wyoming today are making history just as surely as the trappers, immigrants, and ranchers of earlier eras did. The choices being made now about land use, energy development, conservation, education, and community will shape Wyoming for generations to come. What will future people, looking back from 50 or 100 years hence, say about early 21st century Wyoming? Will they see a time when the state successfully transitioned to a new economy while maintaining its character? Will they see a time when environmental degradation was halted and reversed? Will they see a time when the state came to terms with its complex history and honored all the peoples who have called this place home? Will they see opportunities missed and challenges unmet? We don't know, we can't know, but we can hope that those who love Wyoming, in all its forms, will work to preserve what's valuable, to correct what's wrong, and to build a future worthy of this remarkable place. The sun sets over the Tetons, painting the peaks in shades of pink and gold. The wind continues its constant passage across the plains, bending the grass in waves that ripple to the horizon. Somewhere in Yellowstone, a geyser erupts, sending steam and water skyward in a display that has repeated countless times and will repeat countless times more. A rancher closes a gate and heads home as darkness falls. A child in Cheyenne looks up at the stars and wonders what's out there. Life continues, as it has for more than 12,000 years of human presence in this place. Wyoming endures. It changes, but it endures. The mountains remain, the rivers flow, the seasons turn, the stories continue to be told, new chapters added to old volumes, new voices joining the chorus that stretches back through time. This is Wyoming, past, present, and future, a landscape of memory and possibility, a place where history lives, in stone and wind and water, where people have always come seeking something, freedom, fortune, meaning, home, and where the land itself seems to ask something of us in return: attention, respect, humility, care. And so our journey ends. though Wyoming's story continues. The state that was home to ancient hunters and sacred circles, that witnessed the passage of fur trappers and emigrants, that became a territory and then a state, that granted women the vote and created the world's first national park, that built an economy on cattle and coal and oil, that struggled with violence and injustice, that adapted and survived through boom and bust. This state remains a place unlike any other. It remains a place where you can still find space to breathe, silence to think, beauty to marvel at, and challenges to test yourself against. For those who call it home, Wyoming is not just a place but an identity, a relationship with land and community that shapes who you are. For those who visit, it offers glimpses of something increasingly rare, authentic wildness, landscapes that humble and inspire, a connection to the past that feels tangible and present. For all of us, it serves as a reminder that some places still exist where nature dominates, where human presence is small against the vastness of earth and sky, where you can still feel what it might have been like to live in a less crowded, less developed world. The history of Wyoming is the history of adaptation, of people finding ways to live in a challenging environment, of cultures colliding and sometimes cooperating, of resources discovered and exploited, of landscapes protected and treasured, of communities built and sustained against difficult odds. It's a history that continues, that you become part of simply by being here, by paying attention, by caring about what happens to this place and its people. Rest now, and let Wyoming's story settle into your mind. Let the images drift through your thoughts. Ancient hunters following mammoth herds, stone circles aligned with the stars, buffalo herds darkening the plains, trappers in the high mountains, wagons creaking westward, soldiers and warriors in desperate conflict, cattle spreading across the grasslands, miners descending into the earth, geysers erupting in Yellowstone's thermal basins, ranchers working under endless skies, all the countless moments and lives that have made Wyoming what it is. The land remains, the story continues, and somewhere out there, under Wyoming's immense sky, under stars that have watched over this place since long before humans arrived, and will continue watching long after we're gone, the wind blows across the sagebrush, carrying with it the whispers of all that has been and all that is yet to come. This is Wyoming, past and present intertwined, a place of beauty and hardship, of memory and hope, of endurance and change. May it continue, may it thrive, and may we prove worthy of the remarkable landscape and complex history we've inherited.